Test, Klick. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished delegates, dear colleagues, I would like to welcome you all to the first session of the Glasgow Dialogue on funding arrangements for averting, minimizing and addressing loss and damage associated with climate impacts. A special welcome to the Executive Secretary of the UNCCC, Patricia Espinosa. At the onset, let me thank the Executive Committee of the Warsaw International Mechanism for their support in designing the first meeting under the Glasgow Dialogue. Their experience and in-depth knowledge have contributed greatly to the outline of the meeting, and I know that many members will be actively taking part in the dialogue, so a special welcome also to them. The mandate from COP26 comes timely. The science, including as the synthesis in the latest IPCC reports, confirms that losses and damages are already occurring, and that the types and extent of climate risks ahead of us urgently call for our collective efforts to enhance action and support to avert, minimize, and address loss and damage. The latest science also shows that every decimal of increased warming counts. Swift and deep cuts in emissions to limit global warming within 1.5 degrees will be significantly reducing the impacts of climate change. At the same time, as climate change is already a reality, support to vulnerable nations and people are at risk are of essence. In structuring the first climate Glasgow Dialogue, I have sought to include examples of how ongoing efforts relevant to loss and damage context are supported. In the scene-setting sessions today, we will hear from many actors working in the areas spanning from preemptive anticipatory actions and contingency measures to post-impact measures such as ecosystem restoration and examples on how such measures are being financed. I am aware that these examples are a fraction of the landscape of ongoing practices. However, I hope that these examples will serve to initiate and inspire a broader discussion on the many areas of support that are relevant to averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage, including non-economic losses, such as that related to displacement and a wide variety of impacts associated with slow onset events. For the Glasgow Dialogue to be successful, we need to take a holistic view and consider a wide array of solutions and support, including the financial mechanisms of the UNCCC, international institutions, investors, the insurance industry, humanitarian actors, and the whole family of UN organizations and other organizations and bodies working to support developing countries in their efforts relevant to averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage. In exploring funding arrangements, sharing experiences, both opportunities and barriers is of great importance. To that end, in structuring the first Glasgow Dialogue, I have also strived to create ample space that is necessary for parties and non-party stakeholders to actively engage in an open, practical, and pragmatic discussion. These deep dive discussions are envisaged in smaller group settings tomorrow to allow maximum interaction in a limited time. A set of questions is prepared, which I hope will guide your deliberations. The key points raised in each group will be reported back to the plenary at the last day of the first Glasgow Dialogue on Saturday. They will also be captured and posted on the event page for wider sharing and transparency of our work. I am confident that the first Glasgow Dialogue will be a valuable opportunity for all participants to learn the landscape of actors and sources relevant to supporting the implementation of tangible solutions, on the ground to avert and minimize and address loss and damage. The Glasgow Dialogue is a process that will unfold over 3 years. Let us use this time to explore a variety of options in depth. Let us utilize the dialogue to deepen the understanding of a variety of views on the table and collectively explore practical responses to the tremendous challenge that climate change impact represents for the poorest and most vulnerable among us. I encourage you to maintain a spirit of openness and pragmatism throughout the dialogue. The Glasgow Dialogue here in Bonn is the first part of your collective journey to explore arrangements for funding approaches to avert, minimize, and address loss and damage. It will set the stage for the next part of the dialogue, and I trust you all to make the utmost of this time you have together, and I wish you a successful Glasgow Dialogue. I will now hand over the floor to the Executive Secretary. Patricia, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Marianne. Thanks to our SBI chair. Thank you for your leadership, and I am very confident that under your leadership and with the help of our dear co-facilitators, we will have successful outcomes at this session. Let me also thank the ExCom here represented by two of their members for their contribution in helping us to shape this dialogue, which is it's taking place for the first time, and therefore there are no precedents, so we are all learning by doing. So we have greatly benefited from their advice and their wisdom. Dear colleagues, dear friends, I am really very pleased to attend this very first Glasgow Dialogue on loss and damage. It has been the result of a long time of discussions, so I'm really very happy to be here. It's crucial that this work is launched and continues in the best possible way, and I am very pleased to see this very numerous participation and the high interest that this dialogue has attracted. The latest IPCC report, as we all know, confirmed the urgency for climate action, both for mitigating greenhouse gas emissions, but also for addressing the adverse effects of climate change. And this includes the losses and damages associated with the impacts of climate change, which are already being witnessed firsthand throughout the world in our societies, our economies, and our ecosystems, all of which we depend on for our daily lives. The impacts of climate change are borderless. They continue to particularly affect the most vulnerable people, communities, and countries disproportionately. And while we know that averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage is a complex challenge requiring multiple solutions, we also know these solutions can only be achieved through international solidarity and multilateralism. COP26 was a major step forward on the issue of loss and damage, and because it established this dialogue between parties, relevant organizations, and stakeholders to discuss arrangements for funding for averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage in an open and inclusive manner. This first dialogue session is therefore an important opportunity to hear from a diverse range of stakeholders on a wide range of topics. For example, on the funding arrangements already in place, on the good practices that already exist in many places around the world, on identifying success factors and scalable solutions as well. This initial dialogue is also a chance to reflect on the challenges that you face and the lessons already learned, both with respect to accessing funding and identifying existing gaps in that funding. So let me make a few reflections about how I understand support, what we mean or what I mean by support. In my view, support must span the whole risk continuum, including social protection, recovery, reconstruction, restoration, and rehabilitation measures. And we cannot shy away from tough discussions on issues such as livelihood diversification or planned relocation. These are difficult issues for some, but we must not forget that this is not the distant future or future challenge for many vulnerable nations. It is a daily risk right now. To succeed, this dialogue must allow room for a truly inclusive conversation, one that gives visibility to those communities already impacted. Many of them already have arrangements that can channel finance to those who need it most after a weather emergency. This dialogue is also a chance to bring people together from across governments, sectors, and jurisdiction. And this includes those from the humanitarian and risk management domains and many others. And it may include also exploring possibilities beyond the UN climate change process. Again, I do want to urge you to be bold in these discussions. We need your voice, we need your solutions. As I said yesterday, we need you all to work together. 2 years may seem like a long time, but we know that it is not. So I encourage you to make the best use of the time allocated to this very, very important dialogue. You have the mandate and you have the momentum coming out of COP26. I urge you to work together to maximize this potential, to drive the agenda forward, and to ensure our first priority is always those who are suffering from the impacts of climate change now, while preparing to protect others in the future. Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Patricia. And I will now give the floor to the two co-chairs of the Executive Committee of the Warsaw International Mechanism. It is Frode Nedgaard and Jerome Ilagan. And I think it's Frode that will take the floor first. Frode, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Marianne. So my co-chair and I are very pleased to take part in the opening session of the inaugural session of the Glasgow Dialogue on behalf of the Executive Committee of the Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage. The ExCom is actively looking at action and support, and so we are ready to make timely contributions to the discussions on funding arrangements for averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage. The message from the latest science, as synthesized in the IPCC Sixth Assessment Report, is clear. Loss and damage is increasingly becoming one of the most significant challenges of our time. While all of us around the world are affected, the negative impacts of climate change are affecting the most vulnerable people and countries disproportionately, with vulnerable communities in the small island development states and the least developed countries especially at risk. The SBI was requested to organize the Glasgow Dialogue in cooperation with the Executive Committee. The chair of the SBI invited us to develop guiding questions that may facilitate the structuring of discussions at this first dialogue. Accordingly, the Executive Committee prepared a set of questions as its contribution, which the chair has incorporated into the agenda for the 3 settings we have for the first dialogue that takes place this week. We have strived to shape them in a manner that would allow the conversation to cover the entire spectrum of issues to be considered, including good practices, barriers, and challenges. We hope the Glasgow Dialogue will take a comprehensive view on these issues and include all relevant actors inside and outside the UNFCCC. Actors that can help identify demand-driven solutions through an innovative and thorough process in which all involved will be able to engage with an open mind. Our hope is that the discussion will also benefit from work delivered under the Warsaw International Mechanism over the years. For example, the technical paper on elaboration of the sources of and modalities for accessing financial support for addressing loss and damage, and the SUVA expert dialogue, under which information from parties and non-party stakeholders was collected on the type and nature of actions to address loss and damage for which finance may be required. And with these words, over to my co-chair.
Thanks, co-chair. Thanks, SBI chair and ES. One of our expert groups, which helps the executive committee's work to enhance facilitation and cooperation on action and support in the context of loss and damage, has a standing activity to map out support opportunities for elements of averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage, including through the GCF and other sources of support at a country and regional level. In conducting this activity, the expert group is compiling information on sources of support against preemptive action and contingency and risk transfer and post-impact measures. The work by the expert group on action and support has just started. We are hopeful that this group and other expert groups of the Warsaw International Mechanism will provide useful inputs to the dialogue as it unfolds over its course. The Glasgow Dialogue could not come at a more opportune time. The ExCom is working to build on the existing knowledge and arrangements and identify gaps, presenting an opportunity for a collective journey to think outside the box in financial aspects of averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage to the resilience of the most vulnerable. As we meet over the next few days, the ExCom stands ready to help move the Glasgow Dialogue beyond a talk shop, to deliver concrete ideas and proposals that respond to the needs and concerns of the developing countries that are vulnerable to the adverse impacts of climate change. We are very aware that loss and damage are complex issues. We are also pleased to say that the Executive Committee and our thematic expert groups, Task Force and Technical Expert Group, through which we mobilize a diverse range of technical expertise and resources, stand ready to support the process. I wish us all a successful Glasgow Dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you very much to both the co-chairs of the ExCom, and thank you for being with us in the next following days to support this important dialogue. Without further delays, I will now give the floor to our able co-facilitators of the dialogue, Christina Chan from the US and Joseph Theo from Singapore. They will be here to guide you through the next few days, and I am very honored and grateful that you have been able to take of your busy schedule some time to guide us through our deliberations. With that, Christina and Joe, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. It's an honor to be here co-facilitating this Glasgow Dialogue with Joe. We have already had the opportunity to hear some motivating and sobering words, but as we meet for this first Glasgow Dialogue, allow me to remind us all of why we are here. COP26 established the Glasgow Dialogue between parties, relevant organizations, and stakeholders with the aim of providing a space to discuss arrangements for the funding of the activities to avert, minimize, and address loss and damage associated with the adverse impacts of climate change. The Glasgow Dialogue will take place over the next 2 years, with the first dialogue taking place now, the second dialogue convening in a year's time at SB 58 in 2023, and the third and last Glasgow Dialogue taking place at SB 60 in 2024. Over the next days, you will have the opportunity to hear a wide range of views on this important topic from diverse groups of parties as well as non-party stakeholders. You will have the chance to elaborate your own views. In doing so, I invite you to keep in mind that the Glasgow Dialogue is envisaged as a process that will take place over 2 years, and as such, it allows us to build on one another with an open mindset. The first Glasgow Dialogue will take place over 3 days. As per the mandate, the approach and agenda for the dialogue was developed by the chair of the SBI with inputs from the ExCom. Today, day 1 will be conducted in a plenary setting and will have 3 scene-setting remark sessions aiming at giving a glimpse of the landscape of the issue, allowing us to reflect on the different experiences in utilizing, accessing, and providing financial support for averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage, before getting into the interactive discussions that are the essence of this dialogue on the second day tomorrow. Day 2 will consist entirely of breakouts discussions around guiding questions to allow interactive dialogue across diverse stakeholders. And finally, on day 3, we will again reconvene in plenary, and the breakout groups will bring back key points and reflections from the focus dialogues on day 2 for shared learning and understanding. And with that, I'll turn to my co-facilitator, Joe.
Thank you, Christina, and maybe we let the executive secretary and the SBI chair take their leave if they wish. I recognize Antigua Barbuda.
Thank you very much, co-facilitator, and good day to colleagues. AOSIS would like to make a point of order statement. If you may allow me, co-facilitator, I'll continue.
May I clarify what is the statement about? And can it be delivered at a later stage?
Yes, co-facilitator. So it's actually a procedural point on the aspects of the dialogue and how the structure was formed. And so we would like to provide a statement, if possible.
Okay, just to clarify that we were intending to dive straight into this session, but we will permit you to just make that intervention very quickly, please. Thanks.
Thank you very much, co-facilitator. I'll be speaking on behalf of the Alliance of Small Island States. It is no secret that AOSIS and the Group of 77 and China had a common position at COP26. This was to establish a loss and damage finance facility under the financial mechanism, and to lay out a process of consultatively defining the facility and make a recommendation to COP27 to further operationalize. This common position aims at addressing an apparent gap in the existing architecture for climate finance. This is grounded in our country's experience and experiences of addressing loss and damage, an issue that has progressively and significantly worsened since the start of the UNFCCC regime some 30 years ago. In COP26, the final plenary, AOSIS expressed, 1, our grievance with the decision text on the Glasgow Dialogue, and 2, that the Glasgow Dialogue appears to be a standalone dialogue with no clear direction. Noting this reservation, the group acquiesced to the Glasgow Dialogue decision on the condition that it will lead to a conclusion that a loss and damage finance facility will be established at the next COP, COP27 in Egypt. This was the basis on which we understood the decision to establish the Glasgow Dialogue. It should be noted that this statement was officially recorded in the COP26 CMA3 report. AOSIS also notes that the process for deciding the structure of this dialogue was not country-driven. For example, if we were invited to provide such inputs, our group would have recommended that today's agenda would have had space for stakeholders to make their initial interventions on the dialogue. Such inputs would have enabled a more effective, country-driven, party-driven process. Consequently, AOSIS kindly requests that the SBI chair seeks parties and other non-party stakeholders' view on the structure of future dialogues. The IPCC, in its Working Group 2 summary report for policymakers, made the following high-confidence pronouncements, which provide valuable context. This not only relates to the reality of loss and damage being experienced by SIDS, but also the urgency of the UNFCCC regime to arrive at a comprehensive solution to finance our loss and damage response. 1, human-induced climate change, including more frequent and intense extreme weather events, have caused widespread adverse impacts and related losses and damages to nature and people beyond natural climate variability. And 2, losses and damages are unequally distributed across systems, regions, and sectors, and are not comprehensively addressed by current financial, governance, institutional arrangements, particularly in vulnerable countries. With increasing global warming, loss and damage increases and becomes increasingly difficult to avoid while strongly concentrated amongst the poorest vulnerable populations. In sum, science is stating that the problem of loss and damage exists and is caused by human-induced climate change. It also escalates with every increment of global warming and is comprehensively not addressed by current financial governance and institutional arrangements. On the relevance of the dialogue, colleagues, AOSIS still questions the relevance of this dialogue. Ask yourself, are existing funding arrangements capable institutionally of providing climate finance for adequately addressing all loss and damage? If so, it's obvious that we should then only concentrate on whether the levels and quality of such climate finance are predictable, timely, adequate enough to address loss and damage faced by developing countries, especially SIDS. If the existing funding arrangements are not capable, we need to determine how to fill these gaps in the finance architecture in order to adequately address all loss and damage. This said, in our day 2 intervention, we'll not only provide illustrations of existing gaps in this arrangements based on the experiences of AOSIS membership, but also the extensive work in this area that has already been completed under this process. And this will showcase, one, most existing arrangements do not provide climate finance that address all loss and damage from both types of events, collectively or individually. And two, if existing arrangements do provide financing in general to address some loss and damage, it does not qualify as climate finance in line with the relevant provisions of the Convention and the Paris Agreement. These key characteristics include that climate finance is new and additional finance to both development finance and humanitarian assistance, and all developing countries are eligible to access these funds. Additionally, existing funding arrangements currently do not address many loss and damage response activities. This includes, among others, planned relocation for affected people and measures to address permanent loss of, among other things, ecosystem and heritage. Colleagues, this concludes AOSIS's initial intervention on the scope of the Glasgow Dialogue, and our group reserves the right to come back at a later point in today's discussion. I thank you.
I thank the representative of NTO and Barbuda for its intervention on behalf of AOSIS. A couple of responses on my part. I think the first point, as Christina had mentioned in her opening remarks, we were given this mandate, and as per the mandate that the SBI chair has outlined, the approach and the agenda of the dialogue was developed by the chair of the SBI with inputs from the Warsaw International Mechanism, ExCom. So I really wish that you had made this statement in the presence of the SBI chair earlier, but never mind, we took note of your comments. Second point to make is we will take note of your comments and refer to them, particularly your requests for future dialogue, for inputs from parties to be sought for future dialogue. So I give you that assurance. And the third point, just maybe to refer you to day 3, where the discussion, where we have the SBI chair have planned this dialogue to focus much of that time during that day, day 3, to an exchange of views on how this year's dialogue and future year's dialogue will inform, or how this year's dialogue will inform future dialogue. So with that assurance, maybe, okay, I note that there is another request for the floor. And just to remind delegates, we have a fixed amount of time to go through quite a lot of sharings from various experts. So I really hope we can move on with the agenda. But I give the floor to Marshall Islands.
Thank you, co-facilitator. I will be speaking on behalf of PCIDS. I would like to support the point of order raised by AOSIS. Thank you to the Executive Secretary who has reminded us today that we, the parties, do have the mandate and momentum to discuss financing for loss and damage. There is no clearer need than finance for the loss and damage that is right now undermining fundamental human rights in our region. This is unambiguous, this is essential, this is what our island nations have been calling for since the beginning of this process, and which cannot be delayed for another 3 years while we dialogue again in the comfort of this space. The Pacific demands that one of the outcomes of this dialogue process is the establishment of a finance facility for loss and damage by COP27 CMA4. It must be fit for purpose, be regionally appropriate, and emerge from the fact that no climate finance facility existing today, neither humanitarian nor adaptation finance, even comes close to the scale of resources required to address loss and damage, particularly now in today's context of compounding and overlapping risks, eroding our resilience day by day. Let us be clear that at the present time, there's practically no finance available for island communities facing slow onset events. There's no disaster or humanitarian trigger for finance as insidious sea level rise seeps into our underground freshwater lenses, making the water undrinkable and the soils infertile. No operating entity of the financial mechanism will bring back a coral reef killed by acidifying oceans. There is no funding for addressing the loss to cultural sites now inundated by rising seas. There's no financial mechanism to address coastal traditional identities and local knowledges that are eroded. We weren't consulted on the Glasgow Dialogue agenda as mentioned earlier or guiding questions. Please let us use this dialogue to speak on issues taking our land and our lives. We have everything to lose by not dialoguing on the real need for a loss and damage finance facility. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Marshall Islands speaking on behalf of Pacific Islanders. And we'd like to note the comments that you have raised. I recognize Fiji.
Thank you, co-facilitators. Fiji wishes to reiterate the call by both AOSIS and the Republic of Marshall Islands on behalf of PSIDS to use this dialogue over the coming days to focus on advancing the process required to create and formalize arrangements that will create the urgent financing required to avert, minimize, and address loss and damage. We must leave with clarity on the process and the means to deliver an outcome on financing for loss and damage at COP27. Fiji has a range of experience when it comes to designing and defining activities and funding mechanisms that deal directly with loss and damage minimization, whether it is through our direct legal, policy-based, and financial arrangements for state-led support for the planned relocation of communities in situations where adaptation is not an option, our piloting of innovative, low-cost parametric insurance instruments for vulnerable people and livelihoods, or our exploration of contingency arrangements to help curtail losses to livelihoods. The issue and challenge for is clear. We have options, but we lack the resources to advance them at the scale needed. Whether it is through the immediate challenges and losses we face or through the lens of the scientific projections set out in the IPCC's 6th assessment report, it is clear that there remain significant gaps in existing global climate financing arrangements. The existing financial architecture is too rigid to meet the complex, evolving needs associated with addressing, averting, and minimizing loss and damage incurred from climate change impacts, which are also very much evolving and intensifying, especially in the global south. Today, we access and receive is either ad hoc, hard-won, or expensive. We rely on the goodwill of donor countries. Often, these dynamics leave countries like Fiji unhelpfully dependent on the development agendas, political priorities, and financing preferences of others. At the same time, as climate impacts, COVID-19, and other interlinked threats overlap and combine, vulnerable countries are increasingly left indebted, economically exposed, and less reliant. The distinction between financing for adaptation and financing for loss and damage is a distinction that countries like Fiji know all too well. When Cyclone Winston erased a third of our GDP overnight in 2016, it was immediately evident that we have entered a new stage in climate breakdown, a stage in which loss and damage is ever more prevalent and without targeted support, increasingly overwhelming. We need to recognize the causal linkages between mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage. Aggregate failures over the last 3 decades to deliver mitigation outcomes at an impactful scale have increased climate risks. This has increased adaptation needs. Ongoing shortfalls in financing for adaptation have slowed global progress to make the normative and physical changes needed to avert losses. The confluence of these two recognized shortfalls has brought us to the stage at which loss and damage cannot be ignored and must be addressed formally. The loss and damage incurred by vulnerable countries is a cost that comes out of our resources for equitable and sustainable development. It is a loss that impacts our public finances, devastates livelihoods, and limits the potential to build and invest in resilience. It is the situation in which funding earmarked for improving education outcomes is forced to be repurposed for immediate social protection needs. Not only loss and damage is a reality in the Pacific, it is also increasingly concerning metrics at the regional level. Average annual income loss, economic losses from disasters alone in Pacific Island countries exceed $1 billion annually. This number does not account for non-economic losses, the trade-offs involved, or the incremental damage caused by slow onset events. While we often continue to highlight the unprecedented and extreme climate-fueled disaster events that stand out as evidence of dramatic changes to our climate system, we also need recognition that it is a slow onset events and their confluence with existing risks and undermining impact on development efforts, cultural practices, and our way of life that is the most insidious. Without financing to help offset, avert, minimize, and address loss and damage, the overall cost to the global community and economy will spiral beyond the limits of our control. While Fiji has stories of success and resilience, we strongly suggest that this Glasgow Dialogue focus on the tangible steps we can take to address critical loss and damage-related financing needs. This means a robust process with meaningful timeframes, accountability, and clear deliverable outcomes. A successful, robust Glasgow Dialogue that responds to the needs of parties is needed in Bonn to prepare the ground. Only then we will have the potential to deliver the loss and damage financing facility and design process at COP27. Thank you.
I thank representative of Fiji for its intervention. If there is no further intervention, okay, I recognize Timor-Leste. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you very much, co-facilitators, and good afternoon, Excellencies, friends, and colleagues. Timor-Leste is speaking on behalf of the LDC group. As we all know very well, that climate change induced loss and damage, and particularly the addressing of loss and damage remains vastly understated and ignored. The IPCC Working Group 2 report warns that loss and damage are increasing and that existing financial governance and institutional arrangements are insufficient to comprehensively address current and projected loss and damage, especially in the most climate vulnerable parts of the world. The LDC group reiterates the urgent need for a loss and damage finance facility at the end of the Glasgow Dialogue series in 2024. This facility must play a strong role in addressing the significant gaps in financing that remains, including financing during the advert of extreme events, financing for impacts arising from slow onset events, and including non-economic loss and damage. Financial facility must provide financial or financing that is additional to what already exists. It's sustained and quick to access and fills the large financing gaps that currently existing up to date and puts under burden on the LDCs who are the least responsible but among the most vulnerable ones. It was with a great regret and disappointment we say that guiding questions for this Glasgow Dialogue seems to presume that the current humanitarian and DRR support that are currently exist is enough. It is far from it. The support that exists does a little during the aftermath of flood, a hurricanes, or a glacier lake floods outbursts. It does little to accommodate people who have been displaced and need to be recalculated due to just disasters. For productive farmlands that have been destroyed by rising temperatures, for coastal communities who are losing their home to rise of sea level. This is critically important to be part of elements how to move forward to get financial facility in place for addressing these issues. We also would like to put question in place. There is no mandate out of these facility dialogue issues, but we would like to see how the SBI chair can communicate this result of discussion to the Conference of Parties, co-presidencies, as well as the world, because the world is watching us. Finally, we would like to support views expressed by the EOCs before me. Once again, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Timor-Leste, for your intervention on behalf of the LDCs. And I recognize South Africa and colleagues, friends. If you permit me, I will close the speakers list right now so that we can proceed with the rest of our agenda today. So, South Africa, you have the floor, please.
Thank you very much for the floor and for the interest in the time. I will make my intervention very brief. I just want to follow up and note what other colleagues were saying is that we now know that the findings in the IPCC working group report 2 are clear, and we've heard that to successfully provide force support, our first priority is to protect those that's already suffering from the impacts of climate change. And we feel this in our own country and in our own continent. And we do this while we also protect others who will suffer losses and damages in future. And it's clear that there's an urgent need for financial resources. And South Africa would like to request that we focus on contributions and arrangements around finances that is readily available to make timely contributions to all vulnerable countries. Thank you.
Thank you, South Africa. Okay. Just a few words. I just want to assure the delegations that have intervened that we hear you, and we will convey your concerns, your comments, your points to the SBI chair. Also to remind all delegates that there is a space on the third day to discuss some of the issues that you had raised, as well as how we wish to proceed in the next 2 years ahead. So with that, maybe I will move to proceed along with the agenda. And for those who have visited the webpage and have seen the agenda today, you will recognize that it is split into 3 different sections from here. We have, yes, there's too many papers here. We have the first session, which will really be context setting. We will then move on to a very rich panel discussion, well, actually panel presentations on experiences before touching on the financial landscape, which is a very important issue, as I understand from the interventions that were just made. So in terms of context, the first scene-setting session will focus on the science to set the context in which we should strive to enhance action and support for averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage. In particular, we will hear from the latest science as synthesized in the IPCC 6 assessment report. Loss and damage is an issue of increasing visibility. The urgency of the issue is now a fact and clearly recognized by the latest and most authoritative science. Science gives us important indications regarding the urgency of action, temporal, spatial dimensions of the risks and impacts on our societies and the ecosystems on which our livelihoods depend on, also alluding to the needs on the ground. And we heard some of these points as raised by the speakers earlier. Today, we are very honored to have Mr. Reinhard Meckler, lead author, and I hope I pronounced your name correctly, lead author, IPCC AR6 Working Group 2, here today to inform the dialogue on the main findings from the IPCC Working Group 2 contribution to provide the contextual backdrop. Friends, we are a little bit behind schedule. We were supposed to complete this context setting at 4:30, and we are already half an hour behind time. So I request Mr. Meckler to try to be as succinct as possible to highlight the key points from the IPCC Working Group 2 report. After which, I think we'll move straight away to the next section of this dialogue, which is about experiences. So with that, I invite Mr. Meckler. Reinhard, please take the floor.
Clear? Yeah, there it is, okay. Yeah, thank you, Chair. Pleased to be presenting on behalf of the IPCC and be talking about the working group, the insights from our recent Working Group 2 report that may have relevance for the debate and action on loss and damage. In fact, all previous speakers have alluded to the IPCC report, so my job has been made somewhat obsolete. So I'll try to keep it short and just to try to position insights that we had that may be useful for us over the next 2 days to take debate forward, and we have had already productive debate. I'll be taking a risk lens. Risk analysis is quite prominent in the IPCC, so we talk about losses and damages, and then we distinguish loss and damage. I know there's a bit of debate about that, but this allows us to link better to the science that has been produced over the last 20 to 30 years. So losses and damage are, for us, impacts and projected risks. And I'll try to position that and try to go a bit into the policy debate. I will not be able to talk about finance a lot, because that's a bit more emergent, but I'll be ending with some suggestions for a framework that we came up with in the report. Please, the next slide. Yeah. We've heard it. So losses and damages, impacts and risks are happening today already, right? We talk about disruption, dangerous disruption for ecosystems and people. Roughly half of the world's population is actually annually facing water scarcity, up to 3.6 billion people in Asia, Africa, small islands, and the Arctic. There's also quite a few people there, of course, are considered highly vulnerable to climate change. And what's really strong in the report, it's those that are in informal settlements and those that are in growing smaller communities that are the most vulnerable. Please, next one. The next slide here. We got this tableau of impacts and risk, and here you see that. I won't go into lots of detail, but basically the picture is clear, the science is clear, as one of the co-chairs that has alluded to, climate change is leading to suffering. It leads to irreversible impacts, It leads to existential impacts in human systems. It leads to hard limits being reached in ecosystems. I'll probably not go into lots of detail here, just to say also climate attribution has proceeded over the last few years. You see here the minuses, meaning adverse impacts. The coloring, the stronger, the darker it is, means climate change has been attributed to those impacts. And that's very important. This is event or impact attribution. It's impact attribution. It's not trend attribution, right? It's not about heat and flooding, but it's about specific impacts that we have seen over the last few years. So that's a much tougher science than the trend attribution, and this has also made big advances forward, which is important to inform action. I'll probably leave it at that. Let's go to the next one, please. Quite often, risk people talk about assets, physical, monetary assets. That's great, but we know to the loss and damage debate, it's also a lot about the intangibles, or the non-economic losses and damages. And all of this terminology is not right, because these intangibles are basically what makes life interesting and dear to us, right? So it's well-being, it's health, it's culture, it's all these things that we value and that are important. So also we have insights in the report that are basically providing evidence of what has happened in the past. So that's the past, it's not the future. I think that's very important. It happens all over the globe, but it happens in some places. Health, for example, Africa needs attention, and there's more to be talked about. But there's also emerging evidence and scholarship on that. Let's go to the next one, please. This has been the past. The future, unfortunately, the messaging is also negative here. Positive for us if we want to take action, right? So it's about, future losses and damage are projected to increase. It's those people that are close to thermal thresholds, people living along coastlines, cryosphere, and along rivers. And of course, it's also about multiple and compounding risks. Sea level rise will put people in coastal communities at higher risk, and some of these systems, ecosystems, will be submerged and lost. There's also language here. Biodiversity is also facing hard limits, irreversible losses, and that also has dire consequences for those people that depend on it. Bottom line is 1.5 will help us a lot to contain risk, but it will not reduce risk to zero. So we know that, right? Risk cannot be eliminated completely. The report provides evidence across levels of warming that you have seen and studied, as we heard. Next one, please. Adaptation risk management. The good news is it's happening, it's been taken forward. 170 countries or so are taking it forward, many cities are taking it forward, but not enough, right? So we got adaptation gaps, so this difference between adaptation needs and implemented adaptation, and these are increasing. So these we assess to be increasing. We assessed adaptation to be fragmented, small scale, incremental, and reactive, and just not up to speed to deal with the increasing risk that we are seeing. And adaptation cannot address all, cannot prevent all losses and damages. There will be risks that are unavoided and also unavoidable. What risks linked to unavoidable hazards? Sea level rise, we know some certain levels of sea level rise is baked into the system. So risks will also be linked to those unavoidable increases in hazards. That's also tough language. Limits then emerge. Soft limits for low-lying coastal areas we have already. Many natural systems will face some hard limits, coral reefs. At higher levels of warming, small islands may be at risk, and multiple staple crops may also cannot be grown anymore, calling also implying that also soft limits where no further action currently is available will be reached. Next one, please. Quick example I wanted to show on heat. Heat is one of those heavy risks, and it's of course increasing mortality and morbidity. Quick one just to position it. In Africa, we know the excess death rates from heat are double the global average, and that's maybe an underestimation because the data situation is not super. So what we see here in that chart, we see the global picture, how risks will transition over time with limited, incomplete, and proactive adaptation. So it can be contained, but no country in the world is doing the proactive adaptation currently, so we are faced with limited to incomplete adaptation. And the transition for Africa happens much more quickly into the high risk and the very high risk space, because here adaptation, for example, is considered low and projected also to be low given current finance, governance, etc. arrangements. Just as an example, not to position Africa, but just to show the distributional impacts that we're seeing. Let's go to the next one, please. Hope I'm not running too much into time. The question has been a little bit, how can we think about averting, minimizing, and addressing losses and damage? We have a little bit of a different terminology. We call it avoided, unavoided, and unavoidable. So avoided is basically averted, and minimized. Addressed would mean unavoided and unavoidable impacts and risks. If you click on it again, so these are the risks. If you can click on the slide again, please. Next one, yeah. What actions can be taken? Risk can be avoided by doing risk prevention, risk reduction, risk finance, right? But some unavoided and unavoidable risk will remain, and this is the risk retention, as we call it, is residual risk. If you click on it again, we also did a bit of policy assessment building on the literature that exists, and we are suggesting here the risk retention space particularly is one where the loss and damage debate may further proceed with discussion, not exclusively so, but also in synchronization or in coordination with DRR, disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation. So residual risk, risk retention for those that cannot bear the risk, the current impacts and future risks. That's a bit how we just visually put it out, and of course the situation is of course much more complex. If I may, just the next one, then I'm coming to the end. So this was generic framework, but what are we seeing in terms of stylized portfolios of action? We defined 3 types of these: extensive protection, moderate investment, and little adaptation investment. Extensive protection means reducing exposure with flood protection is being taken in some places, vulnerability is reduced, insurance is being bought, a smaller residual risk remains. If you go to the little adaptation investment, other places, we have little exposure reduction because it's costly and technically challenging to do the flood protection. Vulnerability reduction, like improving housing, is being taken forward. Insurance is tough in some of these places. What remains is a big residual risk that is is putting a big burden on, as I spoke to in the beginning, to the most vulnerable. So I come to the last slide, just now to summarize it a bit. 1.1 is happening. It's about dangerous and widespread losses and damages. With increasing warming, the risk will be strongly concentrated among the poorest vulnerable groups. This is the projection, given all the evidence that we have. We have a big adaptation gap. Ambitious adaptation is needed to further prevent, avert, and minimize, as we would call it, losses and damages. It's not enough, because you cannot avoid all of these. There will be a risk retention gap. So further addressing this gap, as it is sitting in the balance sheets and sitting with those households that are most vulnerable and that have a hard time, like little risk retention capacity, so that gap also needs attention. Solutions, as we discussed also in the report, is indeed about financing. It's also about equity and justice, and it's about many other issues. So this was just my short intervention, and there's more in the report, but I hope this was a little bit interesting or useful to help frame the debate. Thanks a lot, and over to the chairs.
Thank you, Reinhard, for your excellent presentation. Maybe I request the Secretariat to leave the summary on the slides. Yes. So friends, these are the key findings from the IPCC report as highlighted by Reinhard. We don't have very much time for discussion, but maybe I'll just open the floor if there's any pressing questions you want to ask. If not, I don't see any. Maybe we'll move to the next session, but thank you, Mr. Reinhard, for giving us an insight to the findings in the IPCC Working Group 2 report as it relates to these very important issues of losses and damages. Message is clear. There are huge gaps and that we need to work towards the solutions as indicated in your slide, the last bullet point. So with that, I'll hand over to Christina to take us through this next session of our agenda, which focuses on experiences.
Thank you so much, Joe, and thank you, Reinhard. We have 2 more sessions left for day 1 in about an hour and 45 minutes. This next session of scene setting is going to focus on country and community experiences with activities to avert, minimize, and address loss and damage and how they're being financed. We've got 5 speakers. We also had intended to open the floor at the end of the 5th speaker to everyone who wants to complement those experiences and types of illustrative activities. As such, given we have an hour and 45 minutes left, what I would like to request from our 5 speakers in this session is to keep it to 5 minutes or less. I've asked the Secretariat for some support. I will likely kindly and gently interrupt you when we get close to closely after the 5 minutes. With that, I will turn it to Max Dilley from the WMO, who will speak and provide his insights on financial support for actions related to early warning systems. Max?
Thank you, co-facilitator. Yes, I was asked to speak about financial support for actions related to early warning systems. I just want to say that early warning systems are not a panacea for the full complement of losses and damages, but yet they make an important contribution. And if I could have the next slide, please. What I mean by that is if we look at the principal climatic or climate-related hazards and the number of disasters, meaning events which were associated with a significant amount of loss and damage, we can see that over the last 50 years, there's been a pretty steep upward trend driven by changes in the hazard characteristics, but also growing exposure and vulnerability. But when we look at the number of deaths in the lower panel, we can see that, with deaths being, of course, a very important indicator of loss and damage, we can see that the trend has been down, and this is attributed in a World Bank publication that some of you may remember from a few years ago to the use of risk information and the proliferation of early warning systems. But if I could have the next one, please. When we look deeper into those numbers, we see that 91% of the deaths are occurring in developing economies. So there's a real need to extend the early warning system coverage to cover those where it's currently not available. Next, please. So we see that in the NDCs, 88% of the LDCs and SIDS have already identified early warning systems as a priority, and we think from the previous slide we can see that that's appropriate. But according to the data that we have, only 40% of the WMO member countries, which is basically the parties, report having fully functional early warning systems in place that end-to-end address all the relevant hazards. And this means that about a third of the people at risk are currently not covered by early warnings. So there's a gap there that needs to be addressed even in this early warning system area. Final slide, please. So I just wanted to conclude by mentioning 2 practical existing mechanisms that are providing finance for early warning system implementation. The first one is CRUISE, the Climate Risk and Early Warning System Initiative. It is currently supporting 60 countries. It's capitalized at around $78 million, but it's aligning those projects with another $400 million in investments so that it achieves a higher leveraging impact. And it's designed to support risk information and people-centered early warning systems in the LDCs and SIDS. It's got an innovative financial mechanism involving pooled funding from 8 donor countries, and it has a set of implementing partners with complementary comparative advantages. WMO, where I work, supports hydromet systems and services. UNDRR supports the right-hand side of the value chain with the delivery of early warnings. And the World Bank, of course, a major development partner with a strong program delivery capability. The other one that I'll mention is, and I see it's now cut off the way the slide's formatted, Climate Science Information for Climate Action. This is a joint initiative between WMO and the Green Climate Fund that was launched at COP26 that increases access to climate finance by incorporating climate science information into the investments, plans, and policies. And now this year, we're starting to roll out capacity development and hands-on support to parties and accredited entities to use climate science to address some of the real risks that Reinhard highlighted. And those measures can be built into the project proposals. And then the proposals, of course, once they're funded, the projects provide the financing, not just for the measures, but also for the technical advisory services that are needed to help parties to put those measures in place. So next slide, final slide. I would just conclude by saying that the capacities that can be strengthened through these existing mechanisms are the same as are needed to support some of the other measures that Reinhard mentioned, risk finance and anticipatory action, and I think we'll be hearing about those later on in the agenda, and I look forward to continuing the dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Max. I'd like to invite Caroline Dumas from the International Organization for Migration to say a few words about migration and planned relocation and how it's being financed. Caroline?
Thank you very much, Chair. Just a few reflections, maybe based on IOM experience. The issue of finance when it comes to human mobility in the context of disasters due to natural hazards, climate change, environmental degradation is a very important topic if we really want to avert, minimize, and address loss and damage. The advancement of the Glasgow Dialogue that brings us here today is an essential step to move this topic forward in a constructive and holistic way. So financing has been pointed out in several discussions actually as a priority to be able to address human mobility. But when we say address in IOM, we mean to develop solutions for people to move, for people on the move, and for people to stay in the context of climate change. And these are our three priorities of action actually on migration and climate change. While there has been growing recognition on human mobility in the context of climate change, the financing and funding landscape is still lacking the attention it deserves. Funding sources remain scarce, and finance related to human mobility in this context is only emerging. Filling the policy gap is a good first step to stimulate the financing of environmental migration and disaster displacement, but we also need to heighten awareness of the donors on what kind of action they need actually to support. So maybe a few words on the needs. The funding needs in relation to human mobility and associated costs are contextual and different according to location, climate change impacts, and mobility response. We have mainly two forms. I mean, in situations of disasters linked to rapid onset processes and displacement due to these processes, the essential needs go from emergency preparedness and response to recovery of the homes, infrastructures, livelihoods. In other words, needs of funding are mostly related to disaster risk reduction, disaster preparedness, displacement management, humanitarian assistance and recovery, including solutions for displacement resolution. Where slow onset environmental change affects mobility, then essential needs and costs stem from migration management to planning for and implementing relocation and re-establishment, again, of livelihoods, infrastructure, both on individual and more collective level. Planned relocation is sometimes a matter of survival for communities strongly affected by climate change, and when adaptation measures are not enough anymore to allow people to stay
on their lands. Relocation is increasingly considered by governments as a last resort option to protect their people, their livelihood, their culture, as we heard a few minutes ago. But planned relocation is a complex and difficult process, one that requires sufficient funding to be sustainable. IOM is working across the world with communities, local or national governments. In terms of relocation, we've worked in Bahamas, for instance, after Hurricane Dorian in 2018, or are supporting Fiji in the framework of the national relocation guidelines of Fiji, or work in Mozambique or in Bangladesh, other situations where financing actually is a challenge. We think that finance, in addition to that, should support not just the hard aspects of relocation, but also, if I can say, the soft aspects, such as the psychological or psychosocial support, cultural and religious appropriateness in the rehabilitation of communities. Labor mobility is also increasingly discussed as one option to strengthen resilience and adapt to climate change. Finally, it is important to highlight that immobility also generates needs and costs. The adaptive response here is not moving, but staying in situ as a voluntary act and decision, but their resources, including financial ones, are required to enable staying in situ with safety, including among them, of course, resilient infrastructures. And alternative may be livelihoods. So in the end, investment in anticipatory action like early warning systems and preemptive actions to protect people ahead of the anticipated hazard is also crucial to reduce displacement and requires increased financing. Acting prior to the onset of a disaster is more effective, cheaper, faster, and dignified than traditional humanitarian response, actually, and the cost of a disaster. So on possible sources of financing, first of all, costs and benefits of human mobility.
Caroline,
Yeah.
I just wanted to say that we're well past the 5 minutes.
sorry.
If you could conclude with some summary in terms of the financial support for migration and planned relocation.
Yes, maybe a few conclusions. There is a need for innovative financing to help especially the most vulnerable to get prepared and adapt to climate change as a preventive way to limit and reduce future losses and damages. We have to ensure that climate finance is not considered separately from broader development priorities. We must find ways and mechanisms to facilitate access to sustainable and predictable finance, especially for most vulnerable again. Climate mobility-related finance must cater mobile and immobile populations. And last but not least, and above all, we now have to break the silos, and like for our climate action, finance to loss and damage must be inclusive and be delivered both by state and non-state actors, including the private sector. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Caroline. I'd like to turn to our third speaker and invite Tagaloa Cooper-Hallow from SPREP, the Secretariat of the Pacific Regional Environmental Program.
Thank you very much, Co-Facilitator, for the opportunity provided to the Secretariat of the Regional Program, the Pacific. I've been asked today to talk about funding arrangements for averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage. You've heard from representatives of the Pacific today that loss and damage is of the utmost priority to the Pacific region, who is experiencing considerable loss and damage that even at 1.1 degree is worsening every year, as mentioned by colleagues on this panel. It is therefore important to acknowledge that at this point we have failed to avert loss and damage. And while our region continues to call for urgent action, urgent increase in mitigation ambition, we are also fully aware that even with the recent pledges to reduce emissions in revised NDCs, the Pacific Islands are locked into a world of extensive and potentially existential loss and damage. As a result, minimizing loss and damage is crucial for our nations and our people. We're working to achieve this through a combination of DRR and adaptation efforts, financed by a wide range of multilateral donors and bilateral arrangements, such as the GCF, the Adaptation Fund, international agencies, and some examples of these include mentioned by my friend and colleague Max from the WMO, is the Cruise Project. What this has done for our communities in the Pacific, it is people-centered, and therefore it is aligned and supported by the indigenous knowledge and indicators, which we now know makes our communities more resilient when they are able to practice the indigenous knowledge associated with early warnings. The Green Climate Fund currently funds the Van Kirap project in Vanuatu, which is delivering climate science and support to support decision makers in their communities to prepare for and adapt to climate variability and change. We have a bilateral support for the Pacific project for ocean acidification by the government of New Zealand to support countries in coastal areas affected by ocean acidification. However, it is difficult, extremely difficult, to keep pace with the climate hazards that continue to unfold in our region. The financial challenges that we face minimizing loss and damage could include project-based nature of support, which makes it very difficult for us to sustain the benefits and the capacity to deliver over multiple and multitude of projects in different donor demands. The greatest gap in our region is addressing loss and damage. In this case, colleagues, the cupboard is bare. There is no meaningful finance at the scale that it is required in our region. Slow onset events such as bleaching and loss of corals have consequences for food security, impacts on local economies, health, and our cultures, and that this is not supported or responded to in a sustained way. Projections tell us that a significant proportion of our commercial tuna fisheries will move from our economic zones into the high seas, where their value to our people and our communities will be lost. Sea level rise, storm surges destroying our cultural sites and washing burial grounds away, that is not simply non-economic losses. They are fundamental losses to our heritage and identity. We experience loss of historical land tenure traditions, loss of practices when we lose biodiversity in coastal areas, loss of traditional knowledge around medicine, food, farming, associated with the losses of biodiversity and with the need to relocate. It goes to the core of who we identify as Pacific people, and this is not something that can be compensated. To conclude, co-facilitator, I offer that even where we have begun to minimize loss and damage and the frequency of climate change events leaves us no time to build back better. These compounding and overlapping risks and continual erosion of our resilience is not fully acknowledged within climate finance regimes. What we need to do is urgently and in a determined way address loss. Thank you, co-facilitator.
Thank you so much, Tagaloa. I'd like to invite our fourth speaker, Kirsten Hagen from the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent, who will share insights on how countries and communities are undertaking contingency measures and dealing with post-impact efforts and how those efforts are being financed. Thank you, Kirsten.
Many thanks. For those of you who don't know IFRC, we're a federation of 192 national organizations working with communities, with volunteers in those communities, mandated to support governments in reducing and managing disaster risks and in responding when they happen. In other words, working to avert, minimize, and address loss and damages. I want to cover two things. One, the role of humanitarians in this space, including in particular the role of local organizations. And then secondly, the current funding environment, both in terms of the types of funding and some of the challenges we see. Just a couple of comments to begin in terms of the humanitarian actor role. The first piece I would like to stress is that this work is all connected. And we in the humanitarian community would frame this avert, minimize, address as a cycle of disaster risk management, which includes starting off with development, then work to reduce disaster risks, work to be prepared for risks that might come, anticipatory action when we know there is an incoming threat, then early response, recovery, and finally starting the development process again. 3 important points I want to make. First of all, when it comes to the response piece, so the addressing piece, communities are always the first responders. They bear the brunt of any crisis that happens, and they are the first to respond, helping themselves, their families, their neighbors, their communities. Secondly, local actors are the ones that are doing the vast majority of this work, be it around averting and minimizing or around the address and respond. In terms of the humanitarian system, I think it's important to note that humanitarian action on the address side, where I know there's a lot of concern, only covers a small portion of the types of needs. And in addition, the humanitarian system is already overstretched. So we are not set up or funded to deal with the rising risks at the scale that we are already beginning to see. Now, in terms of the type of action that is being undertaken, it includes resilience and adaptation programming that reduces disaster risks, such as planting mangroves along shorelines to protect communities from storm surges. It includes promoting or supporting the development of community-based early action plans, such as has been done across the Pacific, working with communities to identify how they want to raise the alarm, how they want to identify and support the most vulnerable people to evacuate, and this goes hand in hand with the really important work that was just outlined by my WMO colleague. We also work on anticipatory action, mostly focused on rapid onset events, which includes developing anticipatory action protocols in order to be able to provide quick cash transfers in advance of a crisis that enables people to move, to evacuate, or to rescue livestock, or to store grains. Then there's the post-impact work, which includes search and rescue, risk communication and community engagement, shelter, food, health, water and sanitation, and so on, as well as help with planned relocation. And in all of these, a really key component that makes any of this work effective is the local action and the collaboration with communities. So in terms of the funding environment, all of you are very aware, and it's been raised a number of times already, that there is very limited formal, if any, loss and damage finance as mandated by the UNFCCC. However, there is in some way a certain amount of loss and damage finance already flowing, just at nowhere near the level needed. Certainly for humanitarian response, there are financing sources and instruments that are relevant to the minimize and address piece, noting that these are falling short of the needs already, and those needs are going to get more. And there's also disaster risk reduction funds that avert and minimize loss and damage. Again, falling short in terms of the size and focus of those funds. In terms of humanitarian finance, most of this has historically been connected to response, so the address side, with some funds for early recovery. And if you're wanting to see an overview of what the humanitarian funds are, the yearly Global Humanitarian Assistance Report is a useful starting point. And I'll give you an example from the Red Cross and the Red Crescent movement, noting that what we do and how our funding works is very similar to OCHA, to different UN agencies, to a number of INGOs. So within the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement, or within the IFRC, we have something called the Disaster Response Emergency Fund. And this is a fund of money that is ready as soon as a disaster strikes. So we can have a national society say, we've just had a cyclone in our country, it happened today, we need money tomorrow, and we need to be able to pay for cash to people who've been affected, or we need to be able to ship tents to people who are needing to find somewhere to shelter. We need to take in food because there's no food available, etc. And at the moment, we have some 34 active DREF operations. We then have forecast-based action, so we have an anticipatory action window inside our DREF, which enables action when we've already forecast that something is going to happen, and we have anticipatory action protocols in place. And then the third piece is around appeals. So where we see there is a longer-term response needed to recover from a major disaster, then we will have an appeal for that country where we will seek funding, so we don't already have funding available. So there are a number of problems that we see. The first thing is that you need me to wrap up.
Remind you, you're over time, so if you can wrap it up, thank you.
So in terms of the problems and the solutions, firstly, we need to increase the humanitarian funding because there's a real shortfall. Secondly, we need to ensure that funding goes to the most vulnerable countries and communities, which is something that's currently not happening. Thirdly, there is a lack of access both to humanitarian funding already, but there is some, and a real lack of access to climate funding for local and non-state actors. So we're never going to address any of these pieces unless we can ensure there's a greater access by local level organizations. And finally, there's locations and programs that are particularly falling through the cracks. So 3 recommendations. The first is to increase investment in the entire continuum of preventing and responding to losses and damages, including scaling up prevention, anticipatory action and response, and funds for slow onset events, such as planned relocation. Secondly, we need to try and work harder to get this funding where it is needed in the most vulnerable and the last mile communities, because we know that the impacts are the greatest for those with the least capacity to cope. And thirdly, we need to invest in locally led solutions. So this isn't just access for local organizations to funding, but actually investing in local capacities of communities and of local organizations to be able to be in the lead of their own response. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kirsten. And our final speaker in this second session, I'd like to invite Sandeep Sengupta from the International Union for Conservation of Nature, who will share some experiences on how post-impact efforts related to ecosystem restoration and rehabilitation are being financed. Sandeep?
Thank you, co-facilitators, for the opportunity to participate in today's very important dialogue. As parties acknowledged in Glasgow, climate change has already caused and will increasingly cause loss and damage, and that, as temperatures rise, impacts from climate and weather extremes, as well as slow onset events, will pose an ever greater social, economic, and environmental threat. The previous speakers have spoken on some of the social and economic threats and impacts. I would like to therefore focus my intervention on some of the environmental threats. In particular, I would like to draw your attention to how some of the world's critical ecosystems are being adversely affected by climate change today, why this matters, and what is being done and can be done to address this challenge. As we have heard from the IPCC 6th Assessment Working Group 2 report, human-induced climate change, including more frequent and intense extreme events, has caused widespread adverse impacts across the world. Indeed, as the summary for policymakers of the Working Group Report 2 notes with high confidence, climate change has caused substantial damages and increasingly irreversible losses in terrestrial, freshwater, coastal, and marine ecosystems. Moreover, the extent and magnitude of climate change impacts are larger than estimated in their previous assessments. This concurs with some of IUCN's own assessments as well. Just to give one illustrative example, IUCN has now identified climate change as the biggest threat to natural World Heritage sites. These, as you know, are globally recognized as some of the most significant natural areas on Earth. Our latest World Heritage Outlook report, published in December 2020, found that 33% of the 252 natural World Heritage sites around the world are currently threatened by climate change. This is up from 25% in 2017 and 14% in 2014. In 2014, the IUCN World Heritage Outlook identified climate change as the most significant potential threat. In 2017, it became the fastest growing threat. In 2020, climate change has now become the most prevalent current threat. Similarly, in another recent global assessment of World Heritage glaciers, IUCN scientists have estimated that almost half of World Heritage sites where glaciers are currently found could lose these glaciers by the end of the century if business as usual emissions continue. Even under a low emission scenario, 8 of the 46 World Heritage sites are projected to be ice-free by 2100. Why does this matter? Important as these iconic places are as natural treasures of the world, it is important not to forget that they, like all other ecosystems, also provide critical benefits in terms of ecosystem services or nature-based solutions that contribute significantly to national economies, local livelihoods, climate stability, and human well-being in multiple ways. For example, 2/3 of natural World Heritage sites are critical sources of water, and about half are estimated to prevent natural disasters such as floods or landslides. To give just one concrete example, in India and Bangladesh, the transboundary Sundarbans mangrove forest alone offers flood protection to over 2,000 kilometers of vulnerable coastline, which would otherwise require an estimated investment of at least $300 in man-made infrastructure. Likewise, the 69 million hectares of forests found in World Heritage sites across the world also contribute to global climate stability by absorbing around 190 million tons of CO2 from the atmosphere each year, in addition to storing 13 billion tons of carbon. However, as noted, these are also under increased threat from climate change today. So what can be done? First and foremost—
Sandeep, I'm sorry, with a little worth about time, if you could move on to the financing of these activities, please.
Yeah, I'm just coming to that. First and foremost, the most effective measure to avert, minimize, and address any permanent loss or damage to the world's ecosystems, including World Heritage sites, has to be to undertake urgent, sustained, and deep reductions in global greenhouse gas emissions across all sectors, as called for by science. Second, in addition to the above, it is also important that countries invest more in the protection, sustainable management, and restoration of the world's ecosystems, and incorporate them more strongly in their policy instruments, including in their NDCs, NAPs, and long-term strategies. This is bearing in mind not only the vital contribution these nature-based solutions can make to climate mitigation and adaptation, but also for biodiversity conservation, enhancing food and water security, and in the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals more generally. Finally, of course, finance has a key role to play in enabling the transformative change that we wish to see in relation to ecosystems. It has been estimated, for instance, that while nature-based solutions can contribute around 30% of the mitigation required to stabilize warming to below 1.5 or 2 degrees centigrade, it currently receives only 3% of climate financing today. A recent report by UNEP has estimated that investments in nature-based solutions need to at least triple in real terms by 2030 and increase fourfold by 2050 if the world is to meet its climate change, biodiversity, and land degradation targets. IUCN, in collaboration with its members and partners, is involved in some of the funding initiatives on nature-based solutions. This includes, for example, the Global Ecosystem-Based Adaptation Fund, which is a 30 million euro fund supported by Germany and administered jointly by UNEP and IUCN, and aims to provide catalytic seed funding to promote innovative approaches on ecosystem-based adaptation, including to help overcome identified barriers for their implementation at scale. But more is needed, and this is my final point, in particular to support indigenous communities, indigenous peoples, and local communities who are not only at the front line of climate impacts, but are also critical stewards of the world's ecosystems and need to be fully supported. I thank you once again.
Thank you so much, Sandeep. I'd like to maybe open up the floor right now. I want to give us maybe about 30 minutes, depending on how much interest there is, before we move on to the third and final scene-setting session for day one. And I open up the floor to invite both parties and non-party observers to share their insights and experiences on funding and financing activities to avert, minimize, and address loss and damage. Please, the floor is open. I'd like to recognize the European Union.
Thank you very much, Christina and Joe, and let me start by welcoming you into your role as co-facilitators. Really appreciate your creating the space for us, the opening of the dialogue. And in particular, after hearing the very powerful voices in the room earlier today, representing some of the most vulnerable communities on this planet, we felt it was very important to come in and to show that we as the EU and others around the room are listening and that we are committed to strengthening and scaling up our response to the kinds of concerns that were described so vividly today. And for those reasons, we remain committed to strengthening and scaling up our efforts to cut emissions, to build resilience, and to support actions that avert, minimize, and address loss and damage. And we welcome the launch of this dialogue. For us, I think we started out on a good note in the sense that the dialogue has been genuinely open and inclusive. It's been informed by real-world expertise and experience. It's beginning to focus very much on the challenge of learning, which for many of us is a very new area of policy and policymaking, but it's also, I think, the strong emphasis on the need that this conversation leads to action. If the conversation is also about persuasion, which I think it will be as well, I think it's already pretty clear that it's less about persuading us about the urgency and the need and the scale for action, but more about persuading each other what is the best way forward in this context. And we think that that is the role of the dialogue, and that we need to take full advantage of the 2 years that we have ahead of us, but in a way that is capable of capturing progress during those 2 years and of catalyzing action both inside and outside our institutions during those 2 years. And I think we've already seen some evidence of that from the agencies that have been describing their work today, that the dialogue has given them an opportunity to focus on where there are gaps in their activities, where there are gaps in their finance and support. I think we'll be hearing in a moment from my colleague from Germany about the efforts that have been made in the G7 process, also to find additional answers to this challenge. We heard earlier from the panel about how the UN Secretary General is focused on scaling up early warning systems through activities like CRUISE. All of this, I think, is in part been catalyzed by the fact that parties to the Paris Agreement have agreed to focus so much attention on this incredibly important challenge. For us, we welcome the concept note that is guiding our work over the coming days, and the fact that we will start by exploring the existing very complex institutions and landscapes that provide support across the full range of actions described in the Paris Agreement with regard to loss and damage, from early warning systems to insurance to humanitarian relief, to the recovery efforts that follow, that will look at the diversity of capacities of agencies that have already begun to associate themselves with the Santiago Network on loss and damage, again, both from inside and outside our regime, and the work, as referred to by the opening panel, that's been carried out by the Warsaw International Mechanism already. We want to start here with this landscaping, but not to stop here. The EU recognizes that the support provided must be strengthened, it must be scaled up, and any gaps that are identified must be understood and must be addressed. But as Patricia Espinosa said at the outset, our first priority are those most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And the test of our success as part of this dialogue is whether we can better address their needs. We enter this dialogue with an open mind as to how best to do that, and we hope our partners will as well. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, EU. Sri Lanka, you have the floor.
Oh, sorry, I was pressing the wrong button, sorry. So thank you, co-chairs, and thank you, a big thank you to all the speakers. It was very interesting to hear all the examples and the initiatives that you were speaking on. I'll keep it very, very short. Just wanted to suggest that it would be useful for countries that are having initiatives to also contribute. For example, in the sense of knowledge sharing and being able to replicate the good practices. Just wanted to add something from Sri Lanka, because in Sri Lanka we've been having a crop insurance scheme for the last 60 years, which is funded by the government funds. So it's the national budget that's holding the burden on implementing this, and it's difficult to develop for developing countries to finance existing processes like this, and it's important that we are able to address issues of supporting these mechanisms that are already in place and identifying these good practices that could be supported. Because we are talking about initiatives and understanding what is already there and mapping them would help us in the discussions going forward. So just want to put it forward, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Sri Lanka. I give the floor to Germany.
Thank you very much, Facilitator, honorable delegates. Well, we heard the voices loud and clear at COP26 that more needs to be done. And against this backdrops, we initiated a discussion among the G7, and we came up with the idea to work towards a global shield against climate risks. So the G7 is the incubator for this, but of course this is not the end of the discussion, this is just the beginning. And this very much reiterates what was said earlier in the dialogue today, to actually recognize the fragmentation of the current financing landscape and to also address protection gaps. So what do we want to do with this global shield? What is this? It's not an abstract construct. It means to overcome this fragmentation. It means to close protection gaps. And it means to make this whole process and this whole system of climate risk financing more demand-driven and inclusive. So we want to integrate the system from analysis, better analysis in the beginning, actually identifying the risks and match it with the adequate financing instruments. All the way from insurance. Insurance is only one solution, we know that. But it's one solution, and we want to shift the burden by committing to premium subsidies, but also all sorts of other instruments that were already mentioned earlier. Early warning systems are of course very important, but also adaptive social security and a whole range of other instruments, pooled risk funding and so on, that are ready to disperse at the onset of a catastrophe. As I said, this is the beginning of a conversation, and we want to make this very inclusive. We started in quite intense dialogue with our friends and partners from the group of the V20. But of course, this is also very relevant for this forum here. So we want to reach out. We want to hear your voice on this, and we will use the SBs here for many informal meetings with you. We will reach out to you, but also please reach out to us to make this work, to get action on the ground as one contribution, not the contribution or the solution, but one contribution to the discussion on loss and damage. And with this, of course, we do not want to anticipate any negotiations at the United Nations in this very esteemed forum, but we want to get action on the ground. It will be trial and error. But we have to make these experiences, and we have to step up climate action. And this is what we want to do. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Germany. Antigua Barbuda, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam Co-Facilitator. And thank you to the esteemed panelists for their presentations. As well as the flexibility of you, the co-facilitators, for allowing us an opportunity to reflect a bit. And I think just three main things that we decided to hold back on in our first intervention, but they're key for scoping. The first is focusing on addressing loss and damage, and addressing is the key part here. And you could hear that from virtually all of the presenters that, that is the neglected bit. So colleagues, we have to be clear that the scope of these discussions must focus solely on funding arrangements needed to address the actual loss and damage associated with the adverse effects of climate change on a cooperative and facilitative basis, as outlined in the Paris Agreement. This is where, as we can clearly see and hear highlight from a lot of the interventions made today, is where the gaps exist. Under the UNFCCC, there have been extensive discussions on the funding arrangements needed for averting and minimizing loss and damage, noting that these areas are on mitigation and adaptation funding arrangements, respectively. Funding arrangements for addressing loss and damage continues to be neglected. And looking at now the definition of funding arrangements, this discussion needs to focus on the funding arrangements, which would cover 1, institutions and entities, and as well 2, their corresponding access modalities and procedures. So we just want to ensure that we're focused on those 2 main areas as it relates to funding arrangements. And the last thing is a quick reaction between this distinction of the loss and damage mechanism, the WIM, and the financial mechanism. So there is a distinction between the role of the WIM and the FM as it relates to addressing loss and damage. And while the WIM promotes the implementation of such approaches through guiding via the ExCom and catalyzing technical assistance via the Santiago network, the FM provides new and additional financial resources on a grant or concessional basis to address loss and damage. This is the most appropriate channel for the provision of these financial resources, and it is through the financial mechanism of the Convention and the Paris Agreement. And this provision of climate finance should be in accordance with the financial mechanism's policies, priorities, and eligibility criteria to ensure equitable access to all developing countries on the terms that we set in this multilateral process. Thank you very much, co-facilitator.
Thank you so much, Antigua Barbuda. If there are no other flags up, I will turn it to India.
Thank you, co-facilitator. I think we have short remarks to make. It is very clear that climate change-induced loss and damage is a reality. Science is clear. Thanks to the presenters, Reinhard made it very clear that it is clearly happening all across the globe. Thanks to all the 5 presenters about early warning multi-hazard systems, about migration, financial support, community as the first responder, and conservation of nature as a DRR initiative. Now, what I want to submit is, by the time we are having these discussions, it is also clear that loss and damage is not only about coastal erosion or riverside erosion. It is also eroding away the hard-won developmental gains for the vulnerable communities, further widening and worsening the developmental inequalities in the world. So that is also important to capture in the loss and damage preparations. So this will not be the debate between mitigation and adaptation has been happening for decades together. Now is the time, I think, to act about loss and damage. That is very critical right now. And this would not require relief. This will not require response. This will require a complete package which starts with preparedness and capacity building of communities and countries, followed by prevention and mitigation, followed by response and relief as it can come. We can not only focus on response and relief as the only ultimate gain for looking at loss and damage. Recovery and reconstruction, a long recovery and reconstruction after the disaster has happened, after the loss and damage has happened, and resettlement and rehabilitation. So it's a complete package. If you want to talk about averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage, that process currently in the Glasgow Dialogue, that is the only portion that looks unclear. The dialogue, as has been talked about, should not become a talk show. It should actually lead to creation of the unclear zone of L&D finance facility by COP27, apart from climate finance and adaptation finance. So 2 years of 3 dialogues should lead towards that. There is no clear mandate, as has been pointed by some of the speakers coming from Glasgow, but we don't have the luxury to have a clearer mandate as spoken by the island nations in the beginning of this dialogue. Thank you so much.
Thank you, India. If there are no other flags up, I will turn it back to Joe to facilitate the third and final session. Joe.
Thank you, Christina, and I'd like to thank the earlier panelists for their very rich insights as to what is out there. My takeaway from their interventions is, yes, there are some ways and some funds out there, but there exist gaps. And I heed the EU's intervention as well, who echoed the Executive Secretary's point about let's focus on the vulnerable, on the needs, and let's find the solutions that we so very need. Coming from AOSIS, I also want to acknowledge the point raised by Antigua Barbuda, really about addressing loss and damage. And that is a key priority for AOSIS. And I want to acknowledge that point, which then provides a good segue to this particular session, which is a session which is focused on finance, or the financial mechanism. So this third scene looks at the funding opportunities that might be of relevance for activities to avert, minimize, and address loss and damage associated with climate change impacts. This session will probe a wide array of sources and relevant funding opportunities from the financial mechanism. And I think this is a point a couple of delegations had raised in the previous session, as well as from Multilateral Development Bank, and from a risk financing facility. We have 4 speakers before us. We have 2 who will participate in person, one from the Green Climate Finance Secretariat, as well as one from the Adaptation Fund, Board Secretariat. And then we will have 2 virtual presentations, one from the Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery, and one from example from the CITS and EOSIS region, which is the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facilities. The purpose of the session really is to see what and how activities that are activities and they are funding the activities for loss and damage, and to see if we can use these examples to enrich our discussion tomorrow. So without further ado, maybe I'll turn to the first speaker. So the first speaker is from the Green Climate Fund, Mr. Juan Pablo Hofmeister. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. Over to you, please.
There we go. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Co-Facilitator, and good afternoon to all colleagues. So I'm very mindful of time, but I do want to take a moment to acknowledge this very important and complex conversation and appreciate the opportunity to join this dialogue. It is, of course, a little easier to, after the first panel, where some of the speakers have already spoken of some examples of support that the GCF has been providing already, and through some of the collaborations that have been exemplified. So what I like to do in my presentation, very briefly, don't worry, Mr. Co-Facilitator, I'm mindful of time, it's just to briefly recall the mandate that was given to the fund, reflect a little bit on the modalities, and sort of also provide you some insight into how we're trying to do better tracking of that support. So if we can go to the first slide. So the mandate, and I will have to read the entire thing out loud, so I'm not going to do that, and instead refer you to it. But I'm not going to pretend to provide, of course, a comprehensive overview of how every single one of the modalities that the GCF has available, it's aligning to provide support for averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage. But in a nutshell, we were asked at COP25 to be mindful of this delicate balance that was given in the mandate to the GCF and continue to provide resources within our existing frameworks. So what we have tried to do, of course, is align or support modalities, for example, readiness, in order to provide countries to be able to identify loss and damage related activities in enabling conditions at the national level. I have tried to provide some examples that you see on the screen. This is not in any way an exhaustive list of how readiness resources, for example, have been deployed for addressing this type of activities. Similarly, through project preparation facility resources, we have been able to develop elements that are very specific of a feasibility nature, components of programs through the PPF, and again, one example in the Pacific where we have done this. And of course, as we continue to do in our report to the COP, we have been identifying the funding proposals for full implementation of activities that have a strong correlation with comprehensive risk management activities, and we have used in particular one indicator of our early resource management framework to be able to track this. So if we can go to the next slide, just to provide a little bit more insight as to how we as GCF Secretariat have been trying to do. First and foremost, let me stress that the assessment we have done of the portfolio and the compatibility with the different work streams of the Warsaw Mechanism, it's something that we have done as Secretariat. It's been an internal exercise. Having disclosed that, what we have found, of course, is that there is compatibility in the modalities that the fund has, and we have been able to see these through examples, and we reported this in the report to COP. In terms of how, for example, through addressing issues of slow onset events, we have deployed resources from early warning systems to actual resources for improving or enhancing ecosystem management. Similarly, for non-economic losses, resources that have been deployed from sort of strengthening livelihoods to more specific type of parametric insurance instruments that have been deployed to this effect. And on comprehensive risk management, of course, then here being the experience much broader. We have actually found a category that we do not sort of see necessarily fitting, and this relates mostly to climate resilient infrastructure, where the GCF has also been programming quite a lot of resources. Now, I just want to, of course, and we're not in a position yet to speak on how we will address the mandate that was given to the fund in Glasgow with regards to diversification of financial instruments and parametric insurance. But the board has recently, recent as 2 weeks ago, entrusted that mandate for us to come back to the board with a document that will be exploring this in further detail within this year. So if we can go to the next slide, and actually before you call me on time, I'm going to just basically skip on this slide and go to the next one because it zooms in on this issue of how we're trying to track resources. So if we can go to actually the next slide. Last year, the board adopted an integrated results management framework. That is how we are tracking resources, particularly during the current during this current trust fund. And within this integrated results management framework, there are two sub-indicators that we hope will help us better track and better understand how the resources are responding to the needs, particularly as they relate to expected losses of lives and expected losses, or changing rather, expected losses of economic losses. The definition that we have been using here when it comes to extreme, for example, is aligned with the UNDRR definition. So just because this is, I know, a question that at least the WIM ExCom has asked us before. Why am I highlighting this? Because we certainly want to make sure that we're being consistent and coherent in how we're tracking these resources in response to country needs, rather than it being an analysis that we do expose of the resources that have been programmed. And because, of course, as a secretariat, we want to make sure that we actually understand better what the country needs are on this subject, and we hope the insights that the application of these indicators will help us do that better as we learn from the resources from the that have been programmed under GCF1. These indicators are just coming into effect as of this latest board meeting, and we will hope to start reporting, probably not at this coming report that we will be submitting to the UNFCCC, but at the one later in the year, right before Sharm el-Sheikh. I will stop at that, and I will thank you once again, Mr. Co-Facilitator.
Thank you, Juan. Maybe now I'll turn to the next speaker, who is also part of the financial mechanism, Mr. Muhammad Asuyuti from the Adaptation Fund Board Secretariat. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Facilitator. I'm going to go through the presentation. In the interest of time, I won't go through all of them, but I will go quickly. So next slide, please. So as a way of background, as a way of background, the Adaptation Fund is one of the 3 multilateral climate finance that serve the Paris Agreement. And the particularity of the adaptation time that we fund concrete adaptation projects on the ground, and most of the time our projects are the first one on the ground. So as of today, we have about $1 billion of portfolio, which covers about 120 projects, and half of those projects are either in LDCs or SEEDs. Unlike the GCF, we do not have the mandate to fund loss and damage, but most of our proposed projects address loss and damage related issues. So over the last 15 years, we have been funding projects which have delivered benefits in relation to loss and damage. And this includes projects in disaster risk reduction, early warning system, and other sectors as well. As of today, we have about 20% of the portfolio which address DRR or early warning systems. So it tells you how much the fund has been supporting these issues. Next slide, please. In terms of tangible results, this slide gives you an idea of what we have been achieving over the last 15 years. And as you can see, at least 2 of the 5 core indicators speaks to the loss and damage. So for example, we have been supporting at least more than 400 early warning systems in developing countries. And that includes country level and also regional early warning system. And we've been seeing the impact of this early warning system on the vulnerable communities on the ground. The second core indicator which speaks to the loss and damage is the one on coastal protection. As of today, we have about 160,000 meters of coastal areas that have been protected with the adaptation funding. Although those are not designed to address loss and damage, but the benefits of those interventions are clearly addressing the loss and damage. As of today, we have about 30 million people who have benefited directly or indirectly from the adaptation fund supports on the ground. Next slide, please. In this slide, I've tried to come up with some of the examples that we have been providing on the ground on addressing loss and damage. But again, I want to re-emphasize that there is no explicit mandate to the adaptation fund to support loss and damage issues. So again, as of today, we have 20% of the portfolio which are dedicated to either DRR or early warning system. And this accounts for about $200 million based on the portfolio of $1 billion we have now. But that's not only the only interventions that address loss and damage. Other sectors like water management, agriculture, food security, and coastal management also contribute to that. In terms of funding opportunities, the board recently has raised the cap which are accessible to countries from $10 to $20 million. And this is accessible, this is available to countries to use as they wish. So there is no prescribed sector or approaches. So if countries want to address loss and damage related issues, they can use this country allocation to do so. In addition to that, we have the regional window, which can support project up to 14 million, and we have been supporting some of the regional early warning system through this window. And also we have some of this innovation and enhanced direct access, which also can address some of these issues. In terms of example of project, and I will end with that, we have been supporting many projects, but I won't go to all of them. I just want to give a few examples. So the first one is the project that we have recently approved for Chad, Sudan. And the idea is to help these two countries to come up with resilience in an integrated manner for issues on the water and mapping of governance, water management. And this can help them to prevent some droughts related issues. The other example that I want to give is the project in Haiti. It's called Implementing Measures to Climate Change, for Climate Change Adaptation, Disaster Risk Reduction. And this project has objectives to enhance the adaptive capacity and resilience of the Haitian education sector. And we, with this project, we help the Haitian government to deal with risk of natural hazard through some appropriate risk assessment tool in the school. So kids are trained to identify some of this hazard and how they can deal with that through these tools. And the last example that I want to give is an innovative one. It's in Georgia. It's called Flood Protection Project in Georgia. And the idea is to help some of these vulnerable communities practicing farming through a flood insurance scheme. The adaptation fund works on the basis of grant, but this project has been supporting the Georgian government to implement a flood insurance scheme that has been operating over the last few years, and it has been delivering some concrete examples. I will end here, but the next slide, if you can go through it, is just the mapping of the funding opportunities we have at the adaptation fund. And again, I won't go through all of them, but it just, and the slides will be available, so in case you want to explore some of these opportunities, they're available at your disposition. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. And there we go, two presentations from the financial mechanism. Now we turn to the next speaker who will share a little bit about what a multilateral development bank is doing to support efforts relevant to averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage. And for that, we have Mr. Niels Holm Nielsen, who will be giving his presentation virtually. Mr. Nielsen, over to you.
From Washington, and unfortunately our IT installations are not fabulous. But briefly, the Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery, or the GFDRR, we are a multi-donor partnership set up within the World Bank Group. GFDRR has been set up to contribute to improve climate and disaster risk management in the context of the World Bank's mandate to work to eliminate poverty globally. The resources that we hold in trust from donor members are allocated as grants, finance, technical assistance, advisory work, and capacity building, and to co-finance, in a few cases, specific climate and disaster risk management related investments in the context of development projects. So we are a relatively small facility. We currently allocate about $60 million a year. But we have a large influence on World Bank Group and IDA financing, and a lot of which is concessional and some grant terms, as well as some influence on other development financing that contribute to create climate and disaster resilience impact. So a core part of the GFGRR's ability to create such impact at scale is our position within the World Bank Group. We use the group's presence on the ground, its technical specialists, its institutional relations with ministries of finance and technical line ministries, and its operational structures and procedures, and of course the weight of its development financing to understand demand and priorities from the client countries we support, and the opportunities through which we have an opportunity to create impact. So the World Bank Group, as you may know, is currently, to my knowledge, the largest multilateral financing partner for climate adaptation. We also are a rather large financing partner for emergency preparedness and recovery, and both of those two areas, of course, are important in relation to the loss and damage conversation today. It's complicated to help generate climate and disaster risk management related impact at national scale. And path to do so requires moving levers at many different levels. GFGRR, we specialize in technical services to countries, currently organized along 14 technical lines of work. And through our many partnerships, we bring global best available knowledge on any climate adaptation and disaster preparedness and response topic to contribute to inform local and national decision-making. And our work focuses on assisting countries define and implement plans to reduce climate risk to infrastructure and spatial and investment planning across sectors. And when we do so, we apply inclusive and participatory approaches and a large range of approaches, including, for instance, nature-based solutions that was referred to by an earlier speaker. Beyond reducing risk, we have deep technical and operational expertise in emergency preparedness, early warning systems, contingency planning, and disaster risk finance. And we are currently supporting more than 70 countries. We look forward to continue to play a role in this space and will avail, of course, all our knowledge and technical expertise to any partner who is interested. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Nielsen, for joining us from Washington. And now we turn over to the next speaker, who will share some views on risk financing facilities in a region. And I turn the floor over to Ms. Elizabeth Emmanuel, who will join us online to talk a little bit more about the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility. Over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Facilitator. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity to be here. And on behalf of CRIF, I am sorry that I cannot be there in person, and I will be speaking to you this morning from Jamaica. So let me first share a sense of the multi-hazard environment of the Caribbean and Central America, the two regions that we operate in at CRIF. In the Caribbean and Central America, the frequency of hazards and disasters are increasing. And although mortality resulting from these disasters seem to be decreasing, economic costs are rising significantly. In fact, as you well know, the Caribbean region is one of the most disaster-prone regions in the world. We have heard of hurricanes such as Ivan, Maria, Matthew, and they have all had devastating impacts on Caribbean countries, in some cases resulting in economic losses of approximately 200% or even more of annual GDP. Let us not forget 2017 with Dominica, where losses were about 226% of GDP in 2017. We know that left unchecked, the economic impact of disasters can generate large losses that disrupt long-term economic growth trajectories and by extension, our pathway to a sustainable future. CRIF was created out of the recognition that natural catastrophes impose a significant burden on the financial liquidity of states to function after a disaster, after a natural disaster, due to the inability to access or the unavailability of liquidity. We were created as an immediate response to Hurricane Ivan in 2004, which caused millions of dollars of losses across the Caribbean, in both Grenada and the Cayman Islands, where losses were close to about 200% of national annual GDP. In fact, the Caribbean governments approached the World Bank for assistance to design a risk financing mechanism to support member governments in the Caribbean with quick liquidity following natural disasters. And this mechanism, as designed by the World Bank, became what was known as the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility. Today we're called CRIF SPC. So we are a regional catastrophe fund for Caribbean and Central American governments, designed to limit the financial impact of devastating hurricanes, earthquakes, and excess rainfall events by providing financial liquidity when a policy, and we sell parametric insurance, when a parametric insurance policy is triggered. What we really represent is a cost-effective way to pre-finance short-term liquidity to begin recovery efforts for an individual government after a catastrophe event. So what we do is we fill the gap between immediate response aid and long-term redevelopment. Today, CRIF has 23 members, 7 more than the original 16 that joined in 2007. We have 3 members from Central America and 13 from the Caribbean. And today we also have 1 electric utility company as a member, because in addition to providing coverage for hurricanes, earthquakes, tropical cyclones, earthquakes, and excess rainfall, we have also begun providing coverage for economic sectors. So, for example, with the support of the World Bank and the US State Department, we were able to launch in 2019 a product for the fisheries sector known as COAST. And in 2020, we launched a product for the region's electric utilities for their transmission and distribution lines, that's the overhead transmission and distribution lines. So I must quickly point out, though, that CRIF was never intended, or is not intended, to be a complete and comprehensive disaster response strategy for its members. CRIF and the parametric insurance products that we provide must not and should not be seen in isolation from other disaster risk financing tools. We encourage our members and countries in the regions that we work in to take a more holistic approach to disaster risk financing and build a financial protection strategy that combines a number of risk financing instruments that address different layers or types of risk. So encouraging countries to look at insurance, yes, but beyond insurance to disaster reserve funds, contingent credit facilities, cat bonds, etc. The selection of parametric insurance instrument as the basis for CRIF policies was largely driven by much of what I've spoken of before, by the fact that parametric insurance is generally, on one hand, less expensive than the equivalent traditional indemnity insurance, because it doesn't really require a loss assessment procedure after a disaster. And it allows claims as such to be settled very quickly. And in the case of CRIF, within 14 days of an event. We have seen for several countries where those 14 days, we have been able to give resources or liquidity to governments, a portion of their payout, even before that 14 days, given the urgent need for liquidity post-disaster. And this is an important feature considering the urgent need for liquidity by governments after a catastrophe to support the most vulnerable in their population, communities, and to also support infrastructure. As I said before, we offer 5 parametric insurance products. Since our inception, CRIF has made 54 payouts, totaling about US $245 million to 16 member governments. Our assessments have revealed, based on our monitoring and evaluation framework, that our payouts have benefited over 3.5 million persons in the Caribbean and Central America. Most of CRIF payouts, so more than 60% of those payouts, go directly into funding immediate post-disaster needs, things like food, water, medicines, clearing of roads. But payouts have also been used for repairing critical infrastructure, for example, in the case of TCI following Hurricane Irma in 2017. Much of their schools were severely damaged. The CRIF payout went into the reconstruction of schools. We've had instances in the case of Anguilla, for example, again, following Hurricane Irma, where the government supported the small hotels and the tourism sector to be able to be ready for the tourism season that was coming up just a few weeks after, or maybe, a few months after that tropical storm, that hurricane hit that country. So as I close, let me say that it is clear that the absence of insurance will have negative consequences for the scale and duration of the economic impacts of disaster. Catastrophe risk insurance, therefore, must be seen as an essential component within government's fiscal policy frameworks and an important tool of climate change adaptation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Emmanuel, for sharing with us how CRIF is making a positive and speedy difference to the people who are vulnerable and who are most at risk at a time of need. So thank you very much for that example. Colleagues, friends, we have completed the 4 presentations. In line with the previous session, maybe I'll open the floor now for any interventions from the floor. And I note also the useful intervention by Germany previously, which spoke a little bit about the shield, which is also part of the discussion in this session, which is what are the funding arrangements out there and how can we work on them to provide solutions that we need to look after the most vulnerable. So yes, I see, well, I don't see, but Secretariat have alerted me that Mexico would like to take the floor. So over to you, Mexico.
Thank
yes,
you.
Camila, right in front. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Now, I'm very glad that we get to have this discussion with the finance sector, given that one of the most pressing issues is access to finance, and I'm glad to see that there are some projects undergoing. But another concern is that we see there's quite a bit of funding for disaster prevention, for early warning systems, and it's definitely needed. We need to build up that resilience. But then there's nothing in the aftermath of disasters happening. And we know that humanitarian aid is not enough, and we need also finance for projects for rebuilding communities. And that's something that is lacking, and that's something that we needed in a fairly short term. It can't be as these other projects that we're familiar with the Adaptation Fund, with the GCF Fund, that take at least 20 months to complete when we're talking about rebuilding our communities after a disaster. It's definitely more than a few weeks of humanitarian aid, but not 20 months. And so we also need to address that beyond early warning systems, beyond disaster prevention. We also need to take into account the aftermath for losses and damage. Thank you.
Thank you, Mexico, for your observation. We hear you. More action beyond disaster relief, and more attention to the aftermath, and quick access. I think those were 3 points that you had raised. Any other interventions? Timor-Leste, my friend Alto, over to you.
Thank you very much, co-facilitators. Timor-Leste would like to speak on behalf of the LDCs. We have already gotten information from different presentations within this room this afternoon. From scientific analysis and data, it is indicated loss and damage is more increasing. From country perspective or from agency perspective, there is a support in place. And also from the current financial entities or operating entities point of view, there are few financial allocation for avoiding loss and damage, averting loss and damage, minimizing loss and damage, not really to address loss and damage. Let's say there is no financial support for rehabilitation issues, displacement issues due to the impact of sea level rise, desertification, loss of crop production because of desertification. It's a slow onset event and also some stream event issues. So there is a gap, financial gap to address loss and damage. We also do note that Green Climate Fund is mandated by the COP to have a balance between adaptation and mitigation. 50% for adaptation and 50% for mitigation. We do see some loss and damage related issues are there, but that's for minimizing, not to address the current real losses and damages. And some of entities are, let's say World Bank, they are supporting some activities related to loss and damage, but not real loss and damage issues to be addressed. Adaptation Fund itself, the name itself is adaptation. So we really need to have a loss and damage facility or finance facility for loss and damage in place to facilitate financial resources for addressing the loss and damage that I just mentioned before, rehabilitation issues, displacement issues, recovery issues after the floodings. Those are key examples, some of examples from both slow onset events and also extreme events impact, arising from the impact of climate change. So we really need to upgrade this dialogue to be meaningful for parties to take decision on this issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Timor-Leste. On behalf of the LDCs, I recognize Norway.
Thank you. We are very glad to be here at the first session of the Glasgow Dialogue to discuss arrangements for the funding activities to avert, minimize, and address loss and damage. We've heard it here today, and the latest IPCC reports are clearly stating the strong and urgent need to step up action to meet the negative or catastrophic consequences of climate change, including loss and damage. The sessions today have also provided valuable insights on parts of the financial architecture, but also gaps that are not addressed or should be looked further into. Norway welcomes the Glasgow Dialogue as an opportunity to get a clear picture and establish a common understanding on the experiences and challenges developing countries are facing in accessing support for loss and damage related activities, including addressing loss and damage. This should then take us to the next steps on how these challenges can be handled, including how to improve funding arrangements. Norway looks forward to an open and active Glasgow dialogue where challenges are put on the table, lessons learned are discussed, and solutions on funding arrangements can be found. Thank you.
Thank you, Norway. There's somebody raising their hand at the back. Yes, please. Introduce yourself, please.
Thank you, co-facilitator. I work with the International Labour Organization in one of the divisions called the social finance, where we work quite constructively on a lot of these issues that have been talked about and discussed in the session. So thank you very much for this opportunity. It's actually very heartening to learn of the different risk transfer mechanisms, especially insurance, being talked about so proactively in the entire funding process, because we are actually exploring mechanisms by which insurance mechanisms can work as a facilitated tool for both livelihood protection and maintenance, as well as livelihood restoration. And within this, looking at shifting the focus, or I would not say shifting, but adding the focus of insurance, not just as a protective tool, but also as a productive tool, which allows people better access to resources such as credit or inputs for agriculture or other sectors. We heard examples from Fiji, Sri Lanka, of course, India as the largest mechanism for that, but we would strongly suggest exploration of looking at mechanisms of insurance to move this from asset replacement to asset preservation. And there have been experiences in Kenya and other places that have shown that these experiments can help vulnerable communities preserve their assets rather than do it as a post-facto replacement, which of course has various other costs involved that have been talked about so elegantly by various people. So we'd just like to put in this stuff. We have worked with, of course, CRIF. We have worked with the World Bank on a lot of these aspects. So we would strongly explore, and thank you very much to the German presentation on actually putting money on the ground and actually putting resources on the ground and implementation. So we'd strongly suggest some discussion around how can these actually be used to have actual impact on the ground in terms of preserving resources and using them more productively in the times to come. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you very much for your contribution and suggestion. If there is no more interventions, okay, I've been alerted. There's one more person raising their hands at the back. Maybe, yes.
Thank you very much, co-facilitator. My name is Salimul Haq. I'm the director of the International Center for Climate Change and Development at the Independent University, Bangladesh. I'd like to thank you for organizing this first session of the dialogue and all the speakers who spoke. In terms of thinking about finance for loss and damage, I think one of the things we need to bear in mind that they are being financed at the moment. They're being financed by the victims. Some of them are actually losing their lives, but most of them are funding losing their money in the impacts of human-induced climate change that they are having to suffer. And while looking at instruments like insurance and others are certainly worthwhile, the poorest and most vulnerable really don't have access to paying premiums to be insured. And we need to be thinking well beyond insurance schemes in terms of preparing and supporting the most vulnerable. And I would argue that protecting, supporting, enabling, and financing the victims, the poorest victims on the planet who had the least to do with the problem should be a priority for whatever financing facility we end up having. That should be a matter of principle as to who we want the beneficiaries of that system to be. And right now we're failing them. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that very poignant reminder, which echoes the point that was raised by the Executive Secretary earlier. So thank you very much for that point. I have one more speaker from Zambia. Maybe after this, we will close the speakers list. Because in the spirit, yes. Okay, so we have Colombia and Zambia. Anyone else? If not, we will close. Yes. This is not an invitation. Vanuatu and one more. Costa Rica. So after Australia. Okay, we have 15 minutes. So if in the spirit of having a Glasgow dialogue, I was intending to give the panelists some opportunity to respond to some of the comments. So I beg that you indulge me the opportunity to allow them to do so. So please try to keep your point, suggestion, comment short. And without further ado, I will pass the floor to Zambia, please.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Facilitator. And it's good to hear progress on the discussions on the financing loss and damage, and also good to have an appreciation of what the GCF, the Adaptation Fund, and others are already doing. We also do understand the context in which the financing for loss and damage is arising. And we do hope that a more very comprehensive approach will be taken at looking at all the thematic aspect of all the financing of the climate change activities under the convention. We discussed loss and damage in the framework that the adaptation needs by far yet to be met, including also the mitigation aspect, financing. And that's why the Adaptation Fund, the GCF, and many others, the GF, exist, is to help us to close the gap of these also pressing issues to meet the targets. And now we have loss and damage on our hands. It is important that the right framework is established to make sure that adaptation, for example, is not succumbing to giving way to loss and damage, or one is suffering at the expense of the other. And that's why we agree with colleagues emphasizing on the new and additional financing outside the realm of adaptation, outside the realm of other important aspects of financing climate change activities. We are discussing the global goal on adaptation, and that entails scaling up adaptation financing in a greater way than it is being done now. And so our hope is that we'll look at the instruments that will best serve the challenges that we face in terms of loss and damage, without compromising the ongoing other financing needs. That's another point to emphasize. We are also in the framework of increasing debt stress in many countries, and I think I do agree with Dr. Salim from Bangladesh that the cost on the poor has been increasing and is increasing, and there's need for an urgent relief to make sure that the fight also against poverty, unemployment, the social services in education, and in health do not suffer as we face these challenges. We have dealing with pandemics, dealing with other challenges. Economic instability is facing us. We need to kind of scale up our efforts to make sure that there is the survival of the vulnerable is assured to a large extent possible. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Zambia. Colombia, please. And can I just request, please try to be short. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chair, and I will try to be brief, but I think that it's important to allow countries to express their views in this important matter, particularly also because we have vulnerabilities in our countries. I'm speaking on behalf of ILAC, and as we have heard from previous intervention, nothing such as finance for loss and damage or finance for averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage exists with that or a similar name under the Convention and the Paris Agreement financial mechanism. We understand the term avert as measures to avoid loss and damage, including mitigation, and the term minimize as a measures to reduce the risk or the amount of loss and damage that would have otherwise occurred and before it occurs, including adaptation. Conversely, we understand the term address as a measures to respond to loss and damage that is not avoided or reduced through mitigation, adaptation, and other measures such as risk reduction. On the one hand, funding for averting and minimizing loss and damage is already covered, as was mentioned by the distinguished delegate from Mexico and others, to some very limited extent through funding for adaptation, as well as other policy areas outside the UNFCCC, such as support for disaster risk reduction, which also plays a critical role in addressing loss and damage. Let's recall that there already exists a climate finance gap, including an adaptation finance gap. Available finance related to loss and damage under the UNFCCC and other big initiatives is mainly for minimizing the risk of it, that is before an event occurs, to reduce residual risk. On the other hand, funding for addressing loss and damage, and we fully support the comments made by the ambassador from Timor-Leste, understood as the one that comes in after the negative impacts have already occurred, that is ex post funding for dealing with loss and damage that is experienced on the ground, is almost inexistent within the UNFCCC. Looking to the future, studies have estimated that annual loss and damage finance needs range from $290 to $580 billion by 2030, 551 and 1,060 billion by 2040, and 1,132 to 171 billion by 2050, with developing countries shouldering most of the burden. These loss and damage costs are separate from the cost of adaptation, and according to recent research, neither post-disaster humanitarian aid nor adaptation finance are adequately addressing the needs of communities that are already experiencing losses and damages. Economic losses directly suffer from climate change reduce countries' ability to invest in climate change mitigation and adaptation measures. We look forward to continue discussing in this important matter, but we would like to see the compromise of countries in terms of providing financial support and the development of financial arrangements, funding arrangements for addressing losses and damages. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Colombia. We turn the floor to Vanuatu, please.
Thank you, co-chairs. And thank you very much to the finance panel members that we've just heard from. I think again, though, what we hear is that the programs that have been presented today by the GCF, the Adaptation Fund, the World Bank, and others is primarily about minimizing the climate impacts through disaster risk reduction, response, early warning systems. But these truly only cover a tiny fraction of the losses and damages that right now are impacting the fundamental human rights of people in the Pacific Islands and around the world. And when response is included, it's almost always short-term and leaves off much as what is required to address the losses and damages. The dangers are clear and present, and there are major gaps in finance to address loss and damage, particularly from slow onset events and non-economic losses and damages. We've listened with great interest to the presentations, and we thank you for the work that you're doing in our nations, in the Pacific and beyond. But with or without explicit changes to the mandates of the operating entities or of the multilateral development banks, we are still aware, more now than ever, that we need a loss and damage finance facility that is anchored within the Convention and the Paris Agreement. That is the gap. That is the outcome, and that is what we hope to address tomorrow in great detail in day 2. Thank you.
Thank you, Vanuatu. And before I pass the floor to Costa Rica, no, so Costa Rica, you're not intervening anymore, I understand.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Facilitator. I actually never requested the floor.
Okay, thank you, Costa Rica. Before I pass the floor to the last speaker, Australia, I just wanted to alert to our panelists that I will turn back to you to give you an opportunity to respond to some of the points that were raised by the earlier speakers. And I encourage you to do it in 1 minute, if you can. Okay, over to you, Australia.
Thanks, co-facilitator. My battery's about to run out, so that was good timing. So I wanted to thank you, thank the SB Chair and the WIM ExCom for helping to organise this, and to you, co-facilitators, and especially to the experts and colleagues around the room for the insights that we've heard today. This Glasgow Dialogue, I know that there are some countries who don't really like it, but I think it's a welcome opportunity to take off our negotiator hats and really discuss the issues and hear from experts and communities and others to really help inform our thinking on this important issue. We heard from the IPCC about the impacts, but also the solutions. Not many people are going to dig down into Chapter 17, but we highly recommend reading it. It really does give us a lot of detailed information about this issue, including how to help funds flow. It's not just about the provision of finance, but what helps us to get that finance to the people that need it through issues such as governance and policies and the appropriate channels. So I think that's worth reading, and thank you to the IPCC and authors for that detail. Also want to thank the financial mechanisms and the others that told us and gave us just a little bit of the insight into what is already happening, but importantly, what are the gaps that are out there still. And we've heard from many countries today about where they are seeing the gaps, and particularly having a humanitarian background, what Mexico said really resonated about the need for quicker response and that recovery money, which is definitely an area that needs more work. As we know in this room, loss and damage is a complicated and very complex issue, much more probably than any of the other issues that the UNFCCC deals with. And financing that is particularly complicated, and those sources are going to come from many varied ways, we don't have a mapping of how that looks. We may never do so because it is so complex. But this dialogue, I think, is critical to help us understand that complexity and bring evidence into our negotiations and our discussions. Today we've discussed a lot about the provision of funds, when we do hear that discussion a lot. But I think it's really important to pick up what the IPCC is pulling and think about how do we enhance the flow of funds from end to end. There's a lot of complexity in that flow, but just providing funds is not mean that it's going to get to those people in the last mile, those vulnerable communities who most need it quickly. So, oh, computer's gone. No, it's not back. So I think I'd like to hear more about that whole spectrum of our finance flow work in the next couple of days. And I think, as noted by Columbia, the figures for loss and damage finance are incredibly high when you look at a lot of the different data from different people. I think we need to explore in this forum a little bit more around the spirit of Paris Agreement 2.1c, where we're not looking just at sort of a donor fund per se, but how do we get the whole global financial system, global investments, global risk, how do we get all of that working towards achieving this AMA on loss and damage goal? I think having that broader discussion about all financial flows would help us move this to a different level of discussion. So co-facilitators, thanks again. We very much look forward to continuing the discussion over the next couple of days. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Australia. We are 5 minutes past the time. Again, in the spirit of Glasgow Dialogue, I think if you don't mind, we will just turn back to the three speakers. The World Bank has left, so maybe we'll start in reverse order. Cliff, Ms. Emmanuel, if I could have some last parting thoughts from you. 1 minute if you can. Thank you.
Okay, sure, no problem, and thank you for the opportunity again. I would like to support a comment that was made about getting instruments like insurance to the people who need it most, the most vulnerable. And I think we really have to begin to think. I mean, we could talk about, sovereign level insurance like CRIF, we could speak about microinsurance, but we really need to determine how do we get those instruments to the persons who need it most. And we really need to begin to think about innovative approaches and solutions. So for example, in the case of CRIF, we're focusing on how governments use their payouts. How do payouts get to those that need it most? In the case of microinsurance, in which we're working with colleagues at the Munich Climate Insurance Initiative and with ILO, my colleague Pranav spoke a little earlier, we're looking at approaches such as encouraging governments to use insurance within the construct of developing social protection policies and strategies that are more shock responsive. How do we work with social development government agencies to purchase insurance that can then support the most vulnerable in the event of a natural disaster? So really supporting that comment. I mean, if we don't get the instruments or the resources to those that are most impacted and those that need it most, we would not have done, really what we set out to do. Thank you.
Thank you. So getting more instruments to facilitate flows to those most in need at a critical time. Thank you for that. Adaptation Fund, over to you, please.
Thank you, co-facilitator. And I just want to say that although we do not have the mandate to address loss and damage, we do operate on the basis of country ownership and respond to country needs. So taking into account the limitation we have in terms of funding, we believe that our actions on the ground contribute to what countries express in terms of needs. So the fact that we don't have any sector allocation, we don't have a prescribed approach, The only thing we check is how our support address and adaptation reasoning. So it's really up to the countries to see to what extent the adaptation fund support can address loss and damage. But again, this is really within the constraint we have, that we don't have a mandate to address loss and damage. I will stop here.
Thank you, Mohammed. Thank you for making that point very clear. No mandate to deal with loss and damage, and it's up to countries to seek support from Adaptation Fund for resilience. Over to you, GCF.
Thank you very much, Mr. Co-Facilitator. And actually, I think I will need to build immediately on Mohammed's point that although GCF has a mandate, we still also have to operate in a country-driven manner. And the only way in which we can sort of program resources for loss and damage, it's of course if countries come to us with looking to program those requests. And this is something that the GCF Secretariat has been standing ready to do, including on issues such as post-disaster recovery, obviously not in humanitarian assistance type of mode, but in reconstruction as well in certain instances. I will perhaps just conclude, there was the point made on humanitarian assistance, and I certainly confirm that the GCF as such is not set up to provide humanitarian assistance, or project cycle certainly doesn't speak of humanitarian assistance. But nevertheless, I will want to perhaps stress that in the case of GCF, through the investment that has been done for adaptation planning, one thing that we do foresee and that in the resources are available is to proactively work with countries to strengthen their humanitarian assistance capacity as part of strengthening comprehensive risk management approaches. And this is something that we think it's quite important in order to be able to proactively address these issues through the support we've been providing for adaptation planning. Thank you.
Thank you so much, GCF and Adaptation Fund, for your comments. The invitation is out to member states to meet them, put in the requests, and seek the funds necessary. Maybe with that, we will end this session. I just thought don't think I'll summarize, but I think there are a couple of points. Number one, we heard in the earlier session, loss and damage impacts are rising. Two, there are gaps, and we need to acknowledge that, particularly financing gap. With respect to financing gap, I think we hear strong calls from a number of delegations here today about the focus has to be on addressing as opposed to averting and minimizing. We also are reminded very strongly about the need to focus on who we need to support. And those are the most vulnerable. And we need to think of ways where we can channel this support, funding mechanisms, new insurance solutions to those that really need it most. And which leads me to tomorrow's session. We have benefited much from the panelists and the presenters today, which I think I shall pause here to say, join me to thank them for taking time out of their busy schedules to share with us their perspective. And we really hope that you will be with us again tomorrow. So maybe just a round of applause to them, please. So thank you so much, and we really hope you will join us tomorrow. So the meat of what we are supposed to be doing here, the dialogue, as it were, will take place tomorrow. I hear the concerns, the point of order that were raised by IOSIS right at the start of the session. We will convey that to the SBI chair. I just wanted, as we as co-facilitators have been given this task to facilitate this program as it is and as devised by the SBI chair. We will convey your concerns to them. We invite you to raise them again in day 3 as we think about the steps ahead. But for tomorrow, what we want to focus is really how to address some of the issues that were raised today. How can we tap on some of the institutions that are out there to really come up with the solutions? let's try to make tomorrow's session solutions-oriented. So I put that invitation out to you. I put that invitation out that let's not come tomorrow with our negotiator hat, but let's try to work together to try to see what we can do together with the institutions, with other non-party stakeholders to see how we can address this very important issue. So in terms of logistics, we have an important request because we've been told that the plan is to have breakout groups. The problem is we don't know how many people will be attending and how many breakout groups to form. So we invite you to register your, I shouldn't use register, to indicate your interest in attending tomorrow's sessions. The guiding questions have been, can we go back to the guiding questions are listed on the webpage, so please have a look at them. When you come tomorrow, please try not to come with prepared statements. Come, roll up your sleeve, let's engage in a meaningful discussion on these questions with a view to finding the solutions that we need to address the problems or the challenges and the gaps that have been identified. To facilitate that kind of interactive discussions, the plan is to have breakout groups, so maybe we'll flip to the next slide. So depending on the level of interest, we may have 1, 2, 3, and maybe 4. But the 4th breakout group, as you can tell, is in the chambers. Not really ideal, so if we can keep it to 3, that will be ideal, but we are not prejudging how many groups. We will break it up into the different groups based on the level of interest. It will be facilitated by Christina for one of the breakout groups, myself. The other 2, we will announce tomorrow. But what we really want from you now is some indication of interest on your part as to how many will want to participate in this exercise, which leads to the next slide, which is please indicate your interests. It will be on the web page, so please refer to them or take a shot if you want of this. Indicate your interests, and then the Secretariat will try their best to decide how many breakout rooms we need and who to go where. So with that, what's the last? Oh, I needed to remind you of the deadline for doing so. So please know that we resume tomorrow, but what's the deadline? To indicate by 10? By 10 o'clock tomorrow. So please indicate your interest by 10 o'clock tomorrow. Yes, Antigua Barbuda, please.
Thank you, co-facilitator, not to cut you mid-wrap-up, but just to clarify that each breakout group will look at all 4 questions, correct? Okay, but it's just to indicate on the survey, monkey survey, that we're interested in participating in breakout groups. So just numbers in general, and then we'll be randomly assigned or something like that. Okay, thanks for the clarity.
So just to clarify, same questions in each breakout group. The idea really is to facilitate small group discussions. The facilitator there will be a report back to the plenary the next day of the different discussions in the different breakout groups. Don't ask me, okay, yes, think of.
Sorry, co-facilitator. Will the report be written?
We're veering into a very important question, which I know you will raise, and it is included in your point. We will have to discuss with the SBI chair as to how the final discussions here are captured and conveyed at a later stage. But that is something that the SBI chair is looking into as we speak. So for tomorrow, the purpose is to have a discussion. We'll try to capture that discussion, and we'll have a report back of those discussions in the plenary, and the SBI chair will be attending those sessions as well. So yes, Antigua.
And just one last thing, co-facilitator, just to note that the precedent has been set with other mandated events that have happened at this session, where there was a written report that was provided for that mandated event, even though that there was not explicit mention in that decision. And I would refer to the KCI response measures workshop that happened over the weekend. So we do hope that there'll be equity in treatment across all of the important thematic areas that we're here discussing. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Antigua, and your point is noted, and the Secretariat will convey it to the SBI Chair. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone for your attention, for your participation, and we look forward to a meaningful discussion tomorrow. So thank you so much.